The story begins with our MC pointing to a specific location on the map. His father clarifies that it is not the place he is referring to, and stated that there's a tiny territory which is like a bean at the very edge. Grace couldn't believe that there's still territory far up. Grace's father praises him for finding the territory, and even told him that he had expected as much from his son. Grace comments how the territory is extremely small compared to the rest of their country. Grace's father turns serious and informs him that from tomorrow he will be the lord of that tiny territory. Confused and puzzled, Grace asks his father to wait. Not wanting to become the lord of such a place, Grace offers to even lick his father's shoes or anything. Hearing his father only responding, Grace knew that it was no use speaking to him as his father had stopped listening to him. Grace's brother Kyle approached Grace and told him to take what their father has given him positively, pointing out how Grace could use it as a chance to become a lord. Turning around, Grace mutters, "Brother Kyle." Grace states that lord or not, the place he is supposed to rule is the farthest land called Asgard. No matter how Grace wants to be positive about it, he just couldn't do it. Grace believes that being banished from the country would not be an exaggeration to describe the measure. Grabbing Grace's shoulder, Kyle tells him that he is weak and that he is in no position to complain. The comment pissed Grace off, and he thought of his brother as someone truly useless. The king of the country stated that Kyle has become a holy magician, and Georg, Grace's other brother, has achieved the title of sword saint. The king turns to Grace, asking him what he has achieved. Grace was told that if he can show some kind of power, his father might change his mind. Annoyed, Grace shares that he already has a plan that he had been working on recently. This intrigued everyone at first, but when they saw Grace holding a hoe, their curiosity turned to confusion. When Grace was asked what is the meaning of that after mentioning the hoe, Grace clarifies that it is not just an ordinary hoe. Grace's talent, which is called World Library, has the power to gain various knowledge from a library in another dimension. Based on the knowledge gained there, Grace stated that he had a blacksmith make what one might call an enhanced hoe. The enhanced hoe simply doubles the efficiency of farm work. Grace believes that by distributing it to the farmers, it would lead to increased food production. However, Grace's brother Georg was not having it and decided to break Grace's enhanced hoe. Shocked, Grace asked Georg what he was doing. Georg reiterated what their father had said, and that is for Grace to show power. Asking Grace about the hoe and production, the king reminded Grace once again that if there's no bread, then he will just have to take one. Opening the window, which has the full view of their kingdom, the king tells Grace to look at their vast Vermillion Kingdom, and how royals like them have led the charge in battle. Land, technicians, people, everything that they lack. They took it by force and grew a large kingdom by using them. Taking off their clothes and showing their upper body, the king mentions that their family, the Vermillion royalty, must always be the symbol of power. The king asks Grace what he is doing, and why he isn't using his knowledge power to strengthen his physical or magical power. With a sad look, Grace responded that if he was able to do that, he would have done it long ago. The king states that it is the very reason why he is sending Grace to Asgard, since he does not see Grace to be useful for anything else. Until Grace completes the development of Asgard, his father won't allow him to return to the royal capital. Even if Grace were to gain knowledge to enhance himself, any enhancement wouldn't work since he was originally weak and couldn't even wield a sword. With the little magic power Grace has, he also couldn't use magic either. Different from his family, Grace turned to studying, which he liked. Grace's family wasn't always like that and even used to have high hopes for him because he was so studious. His family's attitude changed when Grace's talent was discovered. In their country, where power is everything, Grace was given a non-combat skill and was deemed unnecessary. Even so, at that moment, Grace felt incredibly cheerful. Raising both of his arms, Grace states how he is now free. After parting ways with his barbaric, power-obsessed nation, Grace sensed the liberation is much stronger. However, Grace still has one more thing he is concerned about, which is the place he will be ruling Asgard. Still, Asgard, says Grace, as he now ventures to his new territory. Grace immediately notices how terrible the road is, and even questioned if it was a place that people used to live at. Accompanying Grace is the royal guard knight, Vigna, asking him what kind of place Asgard looks like. Even though they're supposed to be a royal entourage, in the end it was just the two of them, and no one else came along. Grace mutters as he then asks Vigna why she came along knowing that much. Well, yeah, says Vigna, as she reminds Grace of the promise she made with him when they were still children and when Grace was often sick. Vigna repeats those exact same words. I'll protect Grace. To come on such a dangerous journey for such a reason, Grace was just speechless. Responding to Vigna, Grace stated that he is now old enough and no longer needed her protection. Vigna asks Grace why he is so stubborn, to which Grace responds that he isn't, and that he is just strong. The door to the carriage suddenly opens and both Vigna and Grace were told to stop flirting inside and leave everything to the coachman. Hearing this, Vigna panicked as she couldn't believe that the coachman had told them that they were flirting. Bowman, the dwarf blacksmith, tells Grace how he has it rough for ruling Asgard. Grace reassures Bowman that he is fine, but then asks Bowman if he is okay journeying with them. Grace knows that it's not easy to become a national exclusive blacksmith, and that Bowman didn't have to give that title up to come with him. Bowman admits that the title sounded impressive, but in reality, everyone made Bowman work all night making nothing but weapons. This led to Bowman having nightmares. Hearing that, Grace tells Bowman that he is always welcome in his territory. What also got the two in the mess was the hoe that Grace proposed, which Bowman made and was just easily destroyed. Remembering how the hoe was destroyed 5 seconds after the unveiling, Grace was barely managing to hold off his anger. Bowman states how the hoe was lamentable, and that the rest of the royal family didn't understand the hoe's value. Changing back the topic, Vigna asks Grace about Asgard. "Oh, right," says Grace, as he remembered that they were in the middle of that question. Since Grace wanted to get a detailed understanding as well, he decides to use his talent, summoning his world library, and orders it to disclose information on Asgard. The world library welcomes Grace, as it guides him to the location of the documents. Asgard was a nation said to have been ruled by the Mad King Susi. With flying ships and exploding devices, it's said that Asgard has developed itself to become a country with unseen technologies. Hearing that, Vigna becomes excited as she tells Grace that it sounded amazing, and what is even more incredible is that Grace is the lord of such a place. Grace agrees with Vigna, but he isn't pleased at all, as he reveals that the country itself has already fallen. Susi had a mysterious power to create anything, but the Mad King never shared his methods. Those techniques that Susi used remained shrouded in mystery. After the Mad King's death, Asgard quickly fell, or so it's said. In other words, Grace and the others' destination is, in a sense, just ruins. What concerns Grace more is that to everything that he said, none of those are the worst. Thanks to Susi's leftover powerful golems killing off every visitor, the country has now become a demon realm where no one dares to set foot. When Vigna said, "What's that all about?" Grace asked her if she was now having second thoughts. Grace tells Vigna that it is what happens when she comes along without doing any research. When Grace stated that there was still time, he was shocked when Vigna's gloomy expression changed, and she responds how she thought that it sounded interesting, and even wishes to fight one of the golems Grace mentioned. Grace thinks about how strong Vigna truly is, and tells himself that he shouldn't be that surprised since Vigna is their country's strongest knight. Vigna changed the topic and pointed out to Grace that the king himself had sent Grace his very own son to such a place. Grace responds, telling Vigna that she is correct. Hearing that same comment, Bowman states that it was far scarier than Asgard itself. Bowman tells Grace that he doesn't have to listen to what the king says. Bowman reassures Grace that if he sticks with him and Vigna, he will not die in vain. Bowman also told Grace that he didn't mind for them to make a detour and head to the nearby port instead. Vigna also agrees with what Bowman said. Hearing how loyal the two were, Grace thanks the two of them. However, Grace has no plans of doing what they suggested. Having been ordered by the king, governing Asgard is Grace's duty as a prince. Besides that, Grace was not feeling pessimistic at all. Knowing that he would be living alongside Bowman and Vigna, Grace is certain that his life will be more enjoyable than the days spent in the kingdom. If the two were willing, Grace states how he would be very happy to share his fate with them. Listening to Grace, Bowman responds that if that's what Grace wishes, then he will not stop him. Bowman was also very much intrigued by Susi's relics. When Vigna said, "You really are," Grace responded with, "What?" But Vigna couldn't speak her thoughts and decided to be silent instead. During their journey, the three encountered and faced a huge canine. Fortunately, Vigna was able to take it down. Grace immediately took back what he had said and called the place they are currently at as Hell. Panicking, Grace suggests changing their names and living in some town instead. "Oh, you," says Vigna as she then asks Grace what happened to the big talk earlier. Bowman shares his worry, stating that it was much worse than he had expected, and that if it weren't for Vigna, then they would have already been monster food. Vigna, on the other hand, felt alive since it has been a while since she has moved her body that much. Looking at Grace's gloomy expression, Bowman calls and asks him if they are truly on the right path to the Mad King's mansion. Grace responds that according to the world map, they are on the right path. The mansion of the Mad King is said to be near the water side. Thinking of the water side, Grace's attention was more drawn towards the flower near it. Watermoon flower, which is often seen near water, is used as an ingredient in healing potions. To Grace's surprise, he immediately finds the watermoon flower and suggests that the two follow the flowers. The three followed their guts and naturally reached the Mad King's mansion. Vigna was very impressed with Grace as they really did reach the mansion just like Grace said. Grace finally let out a sigh of relief as they finally made it, and stated that the mansion is now their new base. Grace suggests that they proceed carefully as they don't know when the golems might attack. Grace orders Vigna to arm herself. Following Grace's order, Vigna gives herself magical enhancement by using Thunder Emperor's Arm. After heeding its call, Vigna pulls out her sword, which then shows that it is coated with lightning, as Vigna activated her full magical armament, showing why she is the strongest of the royal guards. Though Grace is with Vigna, he still couldn't help but think how doomed they are if their plans do not work. Grace halts and asks, "What's that?" "That." Puzzled, the three find a girl laying on the bed. Before Grace could say anything, Bowman cut him off as he stated that the girl was a golem. Grace was surprised at how the golem looked human. Bowman pointed out that with the mansion's current state, there's no way a normal human could remain intact. Bowman has an idea as to what they are seeing, and guesses that the golem is created by unknown technology, to which he states that he would love to see it in action. Grace wondered if the girl on the bed is truly a golem. After touching the golem's head, Grace's talent suddenly activates, transporting him back to the World Library. What puzzles Grace even more is that he was transported to a door which he has never noticed in the World Library before. Grace was then informed that he has encountered knowledge from another world, and that the World Library will now unlock part of that knowledge. While Grace's body stood still, Bowman tries to feed his curiosity and orders Vigna to infuse the golem with magic, stating that golems are moved by the use of magic. Vigna responds that she is already infusing the golem with magic. However, it is still not moving. Finally regaining consciousness, Grace informs the two that the power source isn't magic, and reveals that it uses electricity to move. Activating her magic, Vigna asks to confirm if she should use lightning magic on the golem. Using the Thunder Emperor's arm, Vigna had accidentally caused some damage to the mansion, to which she received an earful from Bowman, telling her to hold back her power as she may possibly break the golem. Annoyed, Vigna responded that she does not care and told Bowman to stop being so noisy. When everything finally settled down, Grace was shocked to see the golem now standing up. Seeing the golem standing up, Bowman was surprised and praised Vigna for doing a wonderful job. Vigna too thought that the result might be great, but she stated that she woke the golem up without thinking, and asked if that was really okay. As Grace remained silent, the golem finally spoke up, greeting everyone with a good morning and introducing itself as Galatea. She then corrected everyone, stating that she is no golem and is formally called a robot. Hearing this, both Vigna and Bowman were confused, asking what a robot is. Inside Grace's World Library, he learned that a robot is a mechanical doll that follows human commands and acts independently. It is a product of technology from another world, different from theirs. Curious about the other world, Grace told the World Library that it had never mentioned such things before. In response to Grace, the World Library stated that objects which the talent user does not even know exist are excluded from search results. However, by encountering the unknown before Grace's eyes and learning about the existence of the technology from another world, a new room of knowledge had been unlocked. Hearing it from the World Library came as a surprise to Grace, an unexpected harvest in a distant land. Under his father, Grace could not have realized the true nature of his talent. By encountering the unknown, the World Library grows even larger. Vigna asked Grace if it was safe to approach the robot. Grace reassured Vigna that it was fine as he had confirmed the safety through his World Library. Grace asked the two if they could keep watch outside for a bit. After getting a little privacy, Grace told Galatea that it was nice to meet her, to which he then introduced himself as the new Lord of Asgard. Grace asked Galatea if her master was Susie. "Affirmative," said Galatea as she stated that not only Susie was her master but also her father. However, since Galatea awoke with a new lord ruling the place, she had already assumed that her father had passed. Grace told the painful news to Galatea that her father had passed away several decades ago, and that as the new Lord of Asgard, he had awoken her. "I see," said Galatea, as she stated that moving forward, she would only recognize Grace, the one who reactivated her, as her new lord, and would only serve Grace. As the first resident of Asgard, Grace told Galatea that he would be counting on her. Being called a resident, Galatea asked Grace why she was counted as a resident. Grace asked Galatea if there was a problem with what he had said. Galatea explained that since she is a robot, she assumed that it would be more appropriate if she were to be used as a tool. Hearing this, Grace guessed that the Mad King must have cherished Galatea like a real daughter, as Grace could tell from how well preserved Galatea was. For Grace, he could not force himself to treat the previous lord's daughter like a mere tool. Curious about lots of things, Grace asks Galatea if she didn't mind being asked about a couple of things. Bowman returns and informs Grace that there was a monster outside. When Grace saw the monster Bowman was referring to, he was not expecting an ancient fire dragon. Grace didn't know Asgard had ancient creatures. Bowman asks if the dragon's territory is Asgard itself, pointing out how incredibly angry it is. Seeing the ancient dragon charging up a fire blast, Vigna orders everyone to get out of the way. Using the skill Water God's Breath, Vigna managed to block the dragon's fire blast. Worried for his friend, Grace calls Vigna's name. Vigna informs Grace that she barely blocked the attack, but she can't hold it out for long. While Vigna holds off the fire blast, she hopes that Grace would at least run away and survive. Grace tells Vigna that there was no way he could do what she was asking. Grace was stopped when Vigna shouted at him, calling him an idiot. Vigna reminded Grace of the promise they made. Vigna then orders Bowman to hold the fire blast for a little bit as she plans on chanting a higher level spell. Though Bowman raises his shield, he tells Vigna that he won't be able to hold it for long. Remembering his father and brother and everything that they said, Grace refuses to bow down to their words. Using his only available weapon, knowledge and thought, Grace was starting to get frustrated since nothing was coming up. Grace remembers that the technology that composes Galatea is incredible, but seeing how such technology hasn't been leaked outside made Grace think that instead of the powerful golem who is said to have killed many visitors, she may actually have been protecting Susie's relics from looters. If that were the case, Grace highly believes that the relics are in the mansion. Grace turns to Galatea, asking her if she has a way to deal with the dragon. Calling Grace my lord, Galatea asks Grace if he wishes to have the dragon eliminated. Grace wanted to know if there was an actual method, to which Galatea responded, of course. Following Grace's command, Galatea proceeds in eliminating the dragon. Grace witnessed how Galatea suddenly jumped, leaping towards the dragon and knocking it down with just one kick. Seeing this, everyone was left stunned, as they did not expect that the dragon would be defeated physically. Grace confirms his theory that the visitors of Asgard were killed by Galatea. Since the time when the Mad King Susie was alive, protecting the land has been one of Galatea's duties. During those times before shutting down, Galatea admits that she may have sent some looters back home a few times. Galatea changes the topic, stating how it is very important and requests compensation. Surprised, Grace asks what he can do. What surprised Grace even more is that the only compensation Galatea requested from him was a pat on the head like how her father used to do it. Patting Galatea's head, Grace asks if he is doing it correctly. Galatea responded that it is, and explained that having her head patted has a nostalgic sensation. An emotion called happiness is being detected in oneself. After Galatea thanked Grace, Bowman sees Vigna suppressing her jealousy, which he suggested that she should honestly say how she too wanted to be patted after working so hard. Frustrated, Vigna becomes embarrassed and ends up repeating what Bowman said. After receiving her compensation, Galatea proceeds to guide her new master, along with Bowman and Vigna, to her father's workshop. Opening the door, Galatea asks them to follow and enter the room. Everyone except for Vigna was very excited as they were about to see the workshop where Susie created Galatea. And so, the three began their journey into the unknown, not knowing that the encounters there would lead to an even greater turning point. Grace was really glad that Vigna came along, even though she was already with them. The Industrial Revolution begins with otherworld knowledge from the Outcast Skill World Library. Fire arrows? Shut up, this is a rifle. With Galatea pressing her hand on an object, a mysterious path suddenly unveiled. Shocked, Grace asked what he had just witnessed. Stairs that appeared where there was nothing before. Instead of getting scared of what is ahead, Grace happily went down first. Vigna pointed out how Grace is so excited. Bowman responded that such a reaction is to be expected since all boys love secret passages. Bowman also stated that he has never seen such door-opening technology before. A door that opens just by waving one's hand. Bowman asks Vigna her thoughts about it, but Vigna just responded, "Who knows?" Galatea informs everyone that it is still too early to be surprised. Opening the door, Grace was stunned and asked what he was seeing. With just one look, Bowman immediately recognized the object in front of them as a furnace. "This is Susie's workshop," says Grace. Bowman turns to Grace, asking him if there's anything he can find in the World Library. Touching the furnace, Grace also thought about a furnace and imagined how it would look so differently. Doors opened, and Grace is once again back in the World Library. Grace learned that Susie's furnace was created using knowledge from another world. The furnace has temperature control capabilities and can withstand any high temperature. Grace repeats what the World Library says about Susie's furnace and tells Bowman that it is what is said in the book. Hearing that, Bowman could only say, "Incredible." Bowman was so glad that he chose to join Grace to Asgard. Bowman could no longer stand idly and asks Galatea if he is allowed to touch it as well. Responding to Bowman's question, Galatea tells Bowman that he is allowed. Clueless about the furnace, Grace asks Bowman if it was really that amazing. In response, Bowman says that it is. Until now, the strong fire used in forging relied on magicians. It couldn't be adjusted, and there was a limit to the temperature that could be produced. With unlimited firepower and adjustable temperature, the range of things Bowman and everyone else can make is incomparable to before. With a cheerful smile, Bowman is certain that they can process any kind of metal as they please. Excited, Bowman states that he will start working immediately. Noticing Grace's smile, Galatea mentions how Grace looked very happy as well. Grace responds that he is. Ever since Grace's talent was revealed, the treatment he received from his relatives only got worse. During that time and situation, Bowman was different. Bowman approached Grace, asking him why he was so down. Feeling distant, Grace responded that it was nothing and that he is just disappointed about various things. Patting Grace's head, Bowman tells Grace there's no need to be disappointed, and that being able to look up anything is an enviable talent. Bowman pointed out to Grace that there are lots of clueless people in the country, including himself, and hopes that Grace would teach them all various things. Hearing that story, Galatea comments how Bowman is truly a kind person. Grace agrees and states that whenever Bowman is happy, he is happy as well. Galatea was about to tell Grace the reason why they came to the basement, but she was cut off as Grace assumed that it was to show them Susie's amazing workshop. Galatea responds that showing Susie's workshop is also part of the reason. Galatea shows Grace a box and hands it over to him. Grace asks what it was, to which Galatea explains that it was from her father, Susie, a letter that is to be entrusted to the next master. Opening the box, Grace mutters, "A letter from Susie." The contents of the letter say that if the letter has been read, it means that Grace has been acknowledged by Galatea, which also means that Susie has recognized Grace. Galatea has received instructions to entrust the letter to someone she acknowledged after Susie's passing. Susie is not certain if the person who will be acknowledged is a transfer from another world like him or just a local. Regardless, Susie has decided to entrust his tools from another world to whomever the next chosen ruler is. However, in return, Susie asks for one request to be fulfilled, and Grace is free to handle his request as he sees fit. In Susie's last message, he pleaded for the next master to take care of Galatea. After reading the letter, Grace becomes more confused with what Susie meant by local or transfer. What confuses Grace also are the other characters that he had no knowledge of, and he pretty much couldn't read the whole letter. What made Grace wonder more is if Galatea really acknowledged him, someone who was helpless when attacked by a dragon. Grace turns to Galatea, asking her where the tools from another world are mentioned in the letter. Pointing to a desk, Galatea tells Grace that it is on the desk. Upon opening the box, Grace was puzzled as he saw a gun inside but had no knowledge about it. "What is this?" says Grace as he is about to touch the gun. The moment Grace touched the gun, the World Library instantly informed him that it had encountered new knowledge of another world. By gaining a certain amount of knowledge about the other world, Grace's other world comprehension rank increases. With that, Grace could now search for technologies and phenomena related to the other world. Overflowing with information and new knowledge, Grace finally obtained the information about the gun inside the box. While holding the gun, Grace learns that it is a weapon from another world that uses gunpowder to fire bullets and has strong killing power. Breathing heavily, Grace's thoughts were filled with the weapon from another world. Galatea tells Grace that the gun is a weapon that only her master can use due to biometric authentication, which is also what she had heard from her father. Grace wondered if he should try using the weapon, since he is certain that no matter how powerful it will just be another wasted treasure if someone like him, who can barely use a sword or magic, were to use it. The moment Grace shot the gun, the sound echoed through the mansion, which Vigna also heard and wondered what created that sound. Seeing Grace tremble, Galatea asks him if he is alright. From what Galatea could tell, the recoil caused the gun barrel to hit Grace's forehead. In Grace's thoughts, it's only natural that Susie would appoint a guardian as capable as Galatea to protect his relics. Magic power, physical strength, talent. Grace is certain that none of those would matter if Susie's technology were to get out into the outside world. Galatea whispers to Grace's ears, telling him that she is interested in the world Grace will create. Galatea is very much intrigued as to how Grace would develop the country using her father's knowledge. To Grace, Vigna, and Bowman, the reason Galatea entrusted the three with her father's letter is because she believed that the three kind people who care for their comrades would surely make Asgard into a wonderful country. Hearing that, Grace remembered that their original goal was to develop Asgard. While everyone is busy cleaning up the debris and mess, Grace asked for everyone to listen and announced that by tomorrow, they will be starting the development of Asgard. Grace admits that they've experienced many unexpected events already ever since they came to Asgard. However, with Susie's relics, Grace hopes that it will help them in creating the best town using the technology from another world. Although Grace was so enthusiastic in sharing such news, he became embarrassed when Bowman mentioned that they will be needing to take care of food and clothing, as well as shelter first. Another problem Bowman pointed out was that the mansion itself is in ruins. Seeing that everyone is now all gathered in one place, Vigna appears and asks what's the reason why they are all gathered up. Grace asks Vigna where she had been. "Where? Well," says Vigna as she then surprised everyone by showing a piece of meat. Vigna went to get some dragon meat since there's only grass growing around the place. After cutting the dragon meat to pieces, Grace advised everyone to eat more meat to keep their strength up since they are going to be busy moving forward. However, after cooking up the meat, everyone was shocked as they saw the meat is now all black, even commenting that somehow it no longer looked appetizing. Picking up one of the skewers, Grace tells Vigna that the meat has completely burnt black, to which Vigna responds, "That's right, Grace then turns to Bowman and asks him if he had followed the instructions from the World Library on how to remove the small bones from the dragon. Responding to Grace's question, Bowman thought that he did. Curious, Grace asked everyone how they handle their meals in their kingdoms. Bowman responded that he always ate out. Vigna answered as well, stating that she is the same with Bowman, choosing to eat outside. Noticing Grace going silent, Vigna asks Grace why he is looking at them with such an expression. With a disappointed look, Grace responded, "Oh, it's nothing." Vigna understands what Grace is trying to say, but explains that they can't help it since they've only practiced swordsmanship and magic. Hearing this, Grace felt embarrassed in ordering a beginner to cook. Left with no other option, Grace tells everyone to wait as he will remake everything himself. Hearing this, Vigna's spirit brightened up as he asked Grace if he would really do that, and commented that he always loved Grace's cooking. After cooking for the two and handing them the meat, Vigna was full of praise, as she stated how she already expected for Grace's cooking to be the best. Bowman, who is also enjoying the food, agrees with Vigna. In a world that only valued strength, nothing else was ever encouraged. That was the way of the world that Grace's father created. Remembering Bowman's words before, asking for Grace to teach the clueless people in the country various things. And with Galatea, who's very much interested in the world Grace is trying to create. Staring at the gun, Grace was thinking about the world that he is aiming for. A few days later, Grace was busy with starting a farm. Exhausted, Grace guessed that he was mostly done with the plowing. Grace's attention was then called, asking for him to look at her direction. Slicing trees like butter, Vigna stated that the sword Bowman reforged for her was truly amazing and how the trees are being cut like grass. Ever since they obtained access to Susie's furnace, Bowman has been absorbed in metalworking experiments. Iron hoe, one of the products produced by Bowman using Susie's furnace. According to the World Library, the numbers directly represent performance. Verk's treasure sword is said to have only a plus 15 bonus, while the iron hoe had plus 30. By simple calculation, the iron hoe has twice the performance of Verk's treasure sword. Galatea brought Grace some refreshments, praising him for doing good work. Galatea then asks Grace if the work progress is going smoothly. Grace thanked Galatea for the drink and told her that thanks to Bowman's hoe, even someone like him made quick progress. Galatea wished that he could help them out. Unfortunately, she does not have any farming programs installed. Hearing this, Grace wondered what Galatea meant by programs installed. Grace tells Galatea that it is okay. With everyone already doing various things, Grace thought that he should at least do the plowing. In order to build the town, Grace and the others were all working hard to secure the minimum necessary supplies and a base. Bowman's task is repairing the mansion and manufacturing tools. Vigna was ordered to clear the forest and to create earthen walls with magic to ward off monsters. As for Grace, Galatea calls his attention and asks what he has been planting. Grace showed a potato and stated that he brought them from the country. Grace explains that while wheat is the staple food, he heard that in some regions they use potato as their main food source. Potatoes grow well in any soil and yield a large harvest. Grace pointed out that unlike meat, potatoes are easy to preserve. Impressed, Galatea comments how Grace is as knowledgeable as ever. Embarrassed, Grace asks Galatea if she actually thinks so. Grace stood up, as he guessed that he may be mostly done with planting. Galatea praises Grace for his good work and shares what her father used to say, which is that crops one worked hard to grow taste exceptionally good. Hearing this surprised Grace, as he never expected for Susie to do farming as well. Galatea responds that Susie did do farming and even had a vegetable garden as a hobby. What surprises Grace even more is when Galatea shares that Susie often hunts monsters to gather fertilizers. Grace wondered what a fertilizer was, and if it was knowledge from another world. Farming, tilling the soil, and planting the seeds. What Grace thought was the normal way is to dance in the fields and pray to the god of harvest. Thinking about it, Grace realized that it was embarrassing to ask again after pretending to be knowledgeable. Grace remembers that he can now search for more information and decides to try it out. Grace orders his world library to reveal more information about fertilizer. From what Grace read, he learned that fertilizers are nutrients that promote plant growth, made from animal excrement, bones, and ash. Fertilizers are used in agriculture in other worlds. I see, says Grace, as he realized that items whose existence is unknown are no longer excluded from search. Thinking if that is what it meant, Grace was now able to grasp a little bit of understanding on how the other world comprehension increases. Grace becomes more intrigued as to how far his skill could go if he were to encounter more knowledge from the other world. Galatea calls for Grace, asking him if he is all right. Surprised, Grace responds that he is. More importantly, Galatea, says Grace as he orders Galatea to bring him the parts of the dragon from before that can be used as fertilizer. Grace is certain that there are still some left from what Vigna processed. Hearing the order, Galatea immediately moved and told Grace to leave it up to her, wanting to be useful like everyone else. Knowing what he had asked from Galatea, Grace wondered if Galatea could actually do it. A few moments later, Grace mutters, No way, as he was shocked to see all the potatoes have already grown so much, even making him wonder if potatoes are supposed to grow that quickly. Exhausted, Vigna stated that she had finished building the wall. Vigna was stunned when she saw the harvested potatoes. Vigna then turns to Grace and asks to confirm if the crops are already ready for harvest. Seeing Vigna, Grace praises her for her hard work. Upon learning of the fertilizer, Vigna becomes more impressed with otherworld technology. Grace agrees and shared that according to the World Library, using dragon as fertilizer is most likely the cause for the super fast growth of the crops. Vigna cheers as she states that the development of their town starts with the dragon they defeated. With the group being able to harvest more than they can handle, Grace asks Vigna if she is hungry. Vigna responds that she is starving and exhausted after building the wall. Vigna's eyes glowed as she asks Grace if he is going to make something. However, Vigna's bright smile instantly vanishes when Grace tells her that she will make it instead of him. Vigna refuses to make anything to eat, reminding Grace how bad her cooking skills are, and the proof was the burnt skewers. Grace calms Vigna down, telling her that becoming strong is important, a saying that is encouraged above all else in the kingdom. Confused, Vigna tries to follow what Grace is trying to say. Grace then pointed out that in the kingdom, they are only taught things that are useful to the country, such as defeating enemies. To simplify what he is trying to relay, Grace tells Vigna that they can't do anything else. Shocked and confused, Vigna mutters, "Grace?" Grace then mentioned that such a way is how his father had operated the country. However, it is different in Asgard, the place he rules. For Grace, knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. Grace gave an example through cooking, stating that heating at high temperatures can aid digestion and prevent food poisoning. Curious, Vigna asks Grace for advice on what she should do. Showing a bright smile, Grace suggests that they boil some potatoes together. Seeing Vigna's confused look, Grace repeats himself and tells Vigna that they are going to boil potatoes. As the two started to boil some potatoes, Vigna noticed that the potatoes suddenly disappeared and accused Grace of snacking them. Grace explains to Vigna that she has put the heat too high. Cooking another batch, the fire was now lowered. But what surprises Vigna is that the potatoes somehow turned into rocks. Grace explains that they have not placed enough water. For the next batch, the two were then surprised when Vigna mentioned that the pot had turned into a forest. Several hours later, Grace and Vigna successfully boiled a potato. After breaking it apart and tasting it, Vigna asks Grace how it tasted. Grace showed a bright smile and told Vigna that the potato is delicious. Excited, Vigna asks Grace repeatedly if he speaks the truth. Grace hands the potato to Vigna, suggesting that she try it out for herself. Grace then states that crops that they worked hard to grow taste exceptionally good. Hearing the exact words Susie once said, Galatea felt happy, showing a faint smile. Vigna hesitates to eat the potato at first, but after taking her first bite, Vigna's doubts went away as she commented how delicious the potato was. Smiling at Vigna, Grace says to her, "Right?" The dragon Galatea defeated became fertilizer, which Grace then tilled the soil with the hoe Bowman made. With Vigna's cooking, Grace mentions how it is the crystallization of their efforts. Grace agrees with Vigna regarding the deliciousness of the potato. Seeing Grace's smile, Vigna's cheeks turned red. "Ha! Good grief," says Bowman as night comes and he is still surveying the mansion and fixing things that need fixing. Bowman comments how the mansion is too run down. After working so much, Bowman becomes hungry. Galatea calls Bowman's attention. When Bowman asks what she wanted, Galatea asks for Bowman if he does not mind waiting. Bowman then asks to wait for what? Opening the door slightly and peeking inside, Bowman finally realizes what Galatea is talking about. Impressed, Bowman tells Galatea, "You're a good one, aren't you?" In response, Galatea says that she is indeed, as she is an excellent robot. Memories of the old Asgard came to Galatea, remembering how the citizens would worry for her for carrying such heavy objects, receiving thanks for her help, being greeted by passers-by, and playing with the kids. For Galatea, everything that happened weren't just happy dreams, but rather happy memories. Grace asks Galatea if it was too painful for her, and suggests that they can continue without her. Galatea responded, "No," and clarified that although it's very different from the records before her hibernation, she wishes to engrave it firmly in her memory. Galatea called Grace and Vigna, asking for them to let her guide them through the village of Asgard. Grace, along with Vigna and Galatea, are now visiting what's left of the village near the mansion. A little while ago, on the night Grace and the others harvested lots of potatoes, Grace shared that his talent World Library can be strengthened. Grace explained further that by gaining new knowledge of the other world, he can enhance his library and acquire even more knowledge necessary for developing Asgard. Seeing how everyone is all busy eating and not listening, Grace calls for Vigna, asking her if she was even listening. However, Vigna just responded that the food was so delicious that she couldn't stop. Vigna pointed out how Grace's potato dish is too delicious, which ended up with her not listening at all. Hearing such praise, Grace guessed that not listening due to that reason was understandable, and asks for Vigna to eat more. Receiving permission to eat more excites Vigna. Bowman, on the other hand, listened to everything that Grace said and was about to summarize what he understood. Surprised hearing Bowman speak, Grace mentions Bowman's name. However, when Bowman explained his understanding, it was all garbled up due to him explaining while chewing the food. Seeing this, Grace asks for Bowman to not talk with his mouth full. Bowman apologizes and explains that he has been working all day and was now starving. "Honestly, what am I going to do with you two?" says Grace as he gives more potatoes to the two and asks for them to eat more. Galatea joins in and repeats what Grace stated, which is to raise the level of other-world knowledge in the World Library, in order to gain knowledge for developing Asgard. To obtain more information, Galatea believes that Grace would have interacted more with Susie's relics. Galatea asks Grace if what she said was correct. Seeing how someone actually understood his intentions and plans, Grace couldn't help but clasp his hands together, thanking God for Galatea. Grace then informs the two that in the mansion, apart from Galatea herself, Susie's furnace, and one otherworldly weapon, there were no other relics. However, Grace believes that there might still be something left in the nearby village. Grace then asks Galatea if he is correct, to which Galatea responds yes. When Grace finally relays the plan, both Vigna and Bowman were eager to hear more. Grace informs the two that they will be exploring the village tomorrow. Returning to the present, Vigna calls for Grace, telling him that the objects they just passed by are a monster's scale. Grace picks the scale up and immediately becomes worried. Vigna was starting to regret that they did not bring Bowman with them. Grace explained how Bowman seemed to be so busy with experiments on the furnace. Observing their surroundings, Vigna could only comment on how terrible of a state the place has become. Grace agrees and shares what he read in the library, which is that Asgard had fallen. Seeing how the mansion was relatively intact, Grace thought that the nearby village would still be intact the same as the mansion. Unfortunately, that was not the case, as Grace was just as surprised after seeing such devastation. Vigna remembered that Galatea was tasked to protect Asgard, which she then asked Galatea how the place ended up in such a mess. Galatea was entrusted with the duty to protect the place, but as her power source ran out, Galatea entered a state of hibernation. Galatea could only guess that the residents may have abandoned the place after her hibernation. Galatea suspected that without her or her father, it became difficult for the citizens to protect themselves from the many monsters inhabiting the land, and thieves targeting Susie's relics. Hearing Galatea's point of view, Vigna then understood why the mansion was relatively unscathed and believed that it was also because that old spark was there. All of a sudden, Vigna tells Galatea, "No, it's okay." Puzzled, Galatea asks Vigna what she meant. Vigna tells Galatea that they are now her comrades and they will easily drive away any monster or thieves. With that in mind, Vigna hoped that Galatea would cheer up. Galatea was thankful for Vigna, but after seeing the scene again, Galatea's thoughts have changed a bit. Seeing the destruction and what was left of her beloved town, Galatea is certain that development is impossible, and it would only cause Grace and the others tremendous hardship. Hearing this, Vigna agrees that the process will be challenging. Vigna then informs Galatea that whenever Grace says he'll do something, he makes sure that the goal will be achieved. Vigna also reassures that both her and Bowman have the same mindset. Grace returned to the group after exploring and apologized for keeping them waiting. Seeing how Grace is carrying and wearing tons of treasures, Vigna asks him what was going on and if he stole all those treasures. Grace responds that it is not a nice way to put it and clarifies that he did not steal anything. Grace then asks for the two to look carefully, as he stated that there are still many valuable things inside. Grace told the two that they came all that way to find things useful for development, which he believes that they can't go back empty-handed. Out of all the treasures that Grace gathered, one struck Galatea most. Seeing Galatea's weird action, Vigna asks her what was wrong. Galatea calls Grace, telling him about the cup. Curious, Grace asks Galatea if she was referring to the cup near him. As soon as Grace touched the cup, he instantly gained knowledge of the other world. Due to obtaining a certain level of knowledge about the other world, Grace's otherworld comprehension rank increased. Grace was shocked to discover a new room of knowledge after touching Susie's cup. After looking further into what he may have touched, Grace learned that it was made of alloy, a combination of metal with other metals or non-metals. Reading the vague explanation made Grace think that it is the same with guns. Even if Grace were to understand the materials and usage, it seemed to him that a high rank of other-world comprehension is required for the creation method. Grace finally returned to his body after Vigna called his name multiple times, responding to her, "Ah, yes, sorry." Grace turns to Galatea as he was about to know more about the cup. "Yes," says Galatea, as she explained that it is a relic from her father. It was an item that Susie distributed to the people to celebrate Galatea's birthday. Staring at the cup, Galatea stated that it is a very important memento for her. Looking at Galatea reminiscing, Vigna tells her how relieved they are for her. Vigna then asks Galatea if the woman in the cup was her, to which Galatea responds that it is indeed her. Vigna gets closer, patting Galatea's head and telling her that she sure does have a doting father. "The people resemble their king," says Galatea, as she stated that it was a phrase that her father used to say often. In the royal capital, everyone had the same wide-eyed stare at the king, which scared Galatea. Hearing that, Vigna guessed that Asgard must have been a really wonderful place. While checking his clothing, Grace suddenly heard a rustling noise. Upon turning around, Grace sees an eye in the bushes. As the monster reveals itself, Grace learns that it was an armored armadillo, a magical beast with scales that repel magic and claws that can tear through iron. A famous trait the beast has is that it has a ferocious temperament. Seeing that it was a scaly monster, Vigna immediately charges in and orders Grace to stand back. Vigna accuses the armored armadillo as the monster that ravaged the village. After finally locating the monster, Vigna instantly used her Thunder Emperor's arm. Grace asks for Vigna to wait as he explains to her what the monster is. However, it was too late for Grace as Vigna made contact. A look of confusion was painted on Vigna's face as she saw how her thunderous needle didn't work. Vigna jumped back and stated that her lightning-clad sword isn't working. Galatea moved forward and told Vigna to let her handle it. Full of anger, Galatea tells the armored armadillo, "How dare you attack the village," before punching the beast and knocking off some of its scales. Galatea informs Vigna that she has now destroyed the armored scales and that she may now take her chance. Still shocked after witnessing Galatea's impressive firepower, Vigna responds, "I got it." Using her Thunder Emperor's arm, Thunderous Breakthrough, Vigna successfully pierced through the armored armadillo. While helping Galatea to stand up, Vigna tells her that they really did it. Galatea warned Vigna of the monster behind her and to watch out. However, since Vigna was too slow to react, Galatea pulled her away and took on the beast's attack. After stopping the armadillo's attack, Galatea asks Vigna if she is alright. Vigna responds that she is, but was shocked when a third armored armadillo appeared. The third armadillo ended up pinning Vigna down, while Galatea was still holding off the second armadillo. Realizing that she has lost her footing, Galatea was certain that it was because of the impact from earlier damage. Before Galatea gets rolled over by the armored armadillo, Grace steps in and pushes her away. Feeling a little bit of pain, Grace asks Galatea if she is okay. Seeing Grace in the battle made Galatea confused and told Grace that it's dangerous, asking him why he even moved closer. Grace becomes confused as to why Galatea would do such a thing. Grace points out that it is only natural to help his comrades. After stopping the third armadillo, Vigna didn't expect to learn that the armadillo she stopped was already dead. Turning to Galatea, Vigna was shocked when she saw Grace standing in between. Another reason why Grace stepped in, he reminded Galatea of a task that he took from Susie after being acknowledged by her as her new master, which is to take care of Galatea. Hearing that from Grace, Galatea remembers what Vigna said, which is that Grace is a man who does what he says he'll do. In front of the armored armadillo, Grace pulls out the gun Susie left. Both Grace and the armored armadillo are now in a standoff. Shooting at the armored armadillo's head at such a close range, Grace successfully finished the beast's life off. Seeing the weapon's destructive power, Grace could only comment on how it had such incredible power. Worried for Grace's safety, Vigna hurriedly ran towards him, asking Grace if he was hurt and if he was alright. In response, Grace asked Vigna if she was alright. Changing the conversation, Vigna asked a more important question, which was if Grace was okay to fight. "Well, yeah," says Grace, as he stated that he felt like he had gained a new ability after mastering how to use the gun at the library. "You idiot," says Vigna, as she scolds Grace and tells him that he could have said so earlier that he can fight, making Vigna worry over nothing. Grace apologizes to Vigna and tells her that she's a bit close. Grace turns to Galatea, asking her if she was alright. All of a sudden, Galatea too got close to Grace, which puzzled Grace, and he asked Galatea what was wrong. In front of Grace and Vigna, Galatea apologizes to them for losing her composure. Galatea then mentioned the gun Grace was holding and shared that when her father entrusted the weapon and letter to her, Susie was already an elderly person. With that reason, Galatea eventually entered a dormant state. When Grace's group woke Galatea up, she was already prepared for the fact that her human father had passed away. However, now that Galatea has a new master to serve, along with Vigna and Bowman, she still struggled to hold on to hope for the future and wasn't able to see the reality much clearly. Looking at the ruins of the old Asgard, Galatea could only say that nothing remains in Asgard anymore. Even though Asgard is said to be a rich land in the state, there are also monsters and many unknown things, which include herself. Galatea asks Grace and the others if it was really alright for them to truly lend a hand. Patting Galatea's head, "Of course it is," says Grace as he told Galatea that it is the reason why they are at Asgard in the first place. Grace turns to Vigna asking her if he was wrong, to which Vigna responds that Grace is correct. Grace promises Galatea that they will figure something out. Filled with hope again, Galatea thanks Grace. Vigna tells Galatea to wipe her nose off, to which Galatea apologizes for showing such an act despite her being a robot. Later that night, Grace apologizes for bringing up such a topic so soon. but feels that it is also urgent that everyone must know. Holding the cup, Grace informs them that the cup is apparently called an alloy. Sharing his notes, Grace informed everyone that that is the only knowledge he can obtain since his rank is too low. Due to low rank, the manufacturing process of the alloy is quite vague. Grace thought that Bowman might know something. However, Bowman responded that if Grace doesn't understand the knowledge, there is no way for him to understand it as well. As a mere blacksmith, Bowman admits that he has worked with all sorts of metals. However, he has never seen such a metal like the alloy before. From what Bowman observed, the material is light yet still quite strong. Finding the alloy cup very interesting, Bowman asks Grace if he can take it apart to experiment. Hey, Bowman, says Grace as he informs Bowman that the cup is an important memento for Galatea, and warns Bowman to not even think about taking the cup apart. Realizing his mistake, Bowman responds, "Oh right, my bad." Galatea spoke up and said no, clarifying that she is allowing for the cup to be experimented on as long as it can be of use. Muttering Galatea's name, Bowman thanks her for giving them permission. The next day, Grace was woken up by someone calling his name. Grace assumes that it was Vigna and asks her to let him sleep a little longer. Bowman reveals himself and tells Grace that it was him that called his name. Grace was shocked seeing Bowman's face first thing in the morning. Since it is quite rare for Bowman to wake Grace up, Grace asks him if he even slept, to which Bowman responds that he did not. However, thanks to that, Bowman shares the news to Grace that he has finally done it. Confused, Grace asks Bowman what he meant by done. Bowman noticed that the alloy is combed with two elements, which are lightness and durability. Bowman borrowed part of the container's handle to examine, which he then tried combining iron and mithril, which he is familiar with. From what Bowman observed, mixing one metal with another substance to give it new properties is pretty much what describes an alloy. Surprised, Grace was certain that what Bowman said was not included in the library description on how to make alloys. Touching the wires Bowman made, Grace asked the World Library to reveal more information about the wire. The World Library informed Grace that the material is called mithril alloy, an alloy of iron and mithril. By combining mithril, which has high magical conductivity, with easily processed iron, magical equipment can now be manufactured more easily and at a lower cost. What surprised Grace is that Bowman's name appeared in the World Library's information as the inventor of mithril alloy. Intrigued, Bowman also checks the book and sees his name written down. It then made Bowman wonder if he had left a small mark in history as a blacksmith. Grace responds that what Bowman left is not just a small mark, but rather a huge step. Holding on to the small piece of mithril alloy, Grace mentions that with an invention like that, the restoration of Asgard may no longer be just a dream. Grace has obtained a new important material, which is the mithril alloy. Another material Grace also obtained is the scales of the armored armadillo, which are said to have strength equivalent to 5 iron plates stacked together, a highly valued material for armor. Grace was also able to test out Susie's gun, and learned that it had enough destructive power to penetrate an armored armadillo. For the land of Asgard, Grace is certain that when subjects start to settle, they will likely live in the village. Since many monsters still lurk, Grace was already planning on making countermeasures, which he deemed to be very essential. Grace also asked Bowman himself to replicate the items. Vigna keeps calling for Grace's name, trying to get his attention. When Vigna asks Grace why he is grinning while staring at metal scraps, Grace responds with, Vigna was starting to get worried for Grace, calling him a pervert for showing such a reaction. Hurt by the comment, Grace asks Vigna to not call him a pervert. Grace explains the reason why he is smiling, and it was because of the mithril alloy he is holding, calling it an innovative invention. Puzzled, Vigna asks what the alloy is. Grace further explained that it is a technique of combining different metals to create new properties. The alloy maintains mithril's magical conductivity while being easier to process and cheaper. Staring at the small scrap of metal, Vigna was surprised to learn that such a small material is highly valuable. Vigna stated how impossible it was, since mithril itself is already difficult to work with. Vigna shares that the craftsman who made her sword mentioned how he struggled to process it with mithril. Handing the scrap of metal, Grace asks Vigna if she wishes to try it herself. Using the Thunder Emperor's arm on the metal scrap, Vigna was surprised as she admits that the small piece of metal really does contain mithril. What Grace liked the most is the price. Grace admits that the mithril alloy's performance is inferior to pure mithril, but it is easy to work with and they can make equipment cheaper with expensive pure mithril. Grace calls it a groundbreaking invention. Vigna's attention was drawn elsewhere and told Grace that their guests may have finally arrived. Looking at his garden, Grace becomes enraged after seeing a group of goblins jump over their earth wall and are taking their crops. In a fit of rage, Grace starts charging towards the goblins, telling them to stop harvesting his precious crops without his permission. However, the goblins were not afraid of Grace. With their clubs, the goblins leap onto Grace, which caught him by surprise. Though the goblins are weak individually, they are mostly known to excel when in group behavior. Pulling out her sword, Vigna instantly took care of the two goblins with her swift movements. Vigna informs Grace that the goblins are pretty weak against strong opponents, which is why they avoid dangerous places. Calling the goblins weak, Grace looks up and sees that there's no end to them. Grace believes that the reason is because they couldn't exterminate all of the goblins when they saw them before. Vigna tells Grace to leave it up to her. Vigna could no longer hold her anger as she saw how the goblins are easily stealing the fruits of their labor. "How dare you?" says Vigna as she uses the Thunder Emperor's arm, Thunderous Rain. The skill was so powerful that even Grace couldn't believe that Vigna would use such a powerful skill on goblins. As Grace heard how Vigna mocked and insulted the goblins, he remained speechless. Seeing how Vigna annihilated the goblins except for one, Grace asks for Vigna to wait and to not kill the remaining goblin. Grace orders Vigna to let the last goblin escape. Vigna smiles as she tells Grace that he is truly smart. From Vigna's understanding, they will be cornering the goblins to their nest and wiping them out completely. Hearing that, Grace responds that they will be doing no such thing, and points out how scary of a plan it is. Grace explains that goblins never approach a place they deem dangerous again, which Grace believes means the only goblin left will serve as a goblin repellent. Grace still believes that they have to do something, as he is certain that there is more than one goblin settlement. Vigna suggests adding spikes to the wall like the clubs that the goblins are using. Vigna wonders if that idea would make the wall easier to climb. Hearing that, Grace responds, "That's it." Puzzled, Vigna asks Grace if he had thought of something. Grace suddenly runs off somewhere, asking for Vigna to wait a little. Thinking of the mithril alloy, Grace was very eager to show his new idea, an invention that will go down in the World Library. Several days later, a couple of goblins returned to Asgard territory and noticed that something new was added on top of the wall. Observing all this, Vigna asks if those goblins outside are from another settlement. Vigna stated that the goblins are a step too late, as she believes that the goblins won't be able to invade them now. Grace agrees, as he is certain that goblins too must dislike pain. With his attention being called, Grace turns and sees that it was Galatea, asking him if that was a new invention. Grace responded that it is. Grace explains that by lining the top of the wall with mithril alloy spikes, they can prevent goblins from climbing over. "I see," Galatea says. Vigna calls Grace's attention, asking him if that is going to be okay. Grace responds that it is. Witnessing how the goblins do their best to get over the fenced wall by climbing onto each other, Grace states that it's all taken care of. Vigna wonders just how badly the goblins want potatoes. Grace had no doubts that the goblins would seek out the potatoes since they are of top quality. Grace suggests that they observe, as he reveals that the iron fence has another trick. The mithril alloy, like pure mithril, can store magical energy. The mithril alloy placed on the wall currently is charged with Vigna's lightning magic. Hearing a bzzzt sound, Vigna and Grace witnessed how all the goblins were electrocuted as soon as they made contact with the fence. Experiencing such harsh defeat, the goblins decided to leave. Grace laughs as he points out how the goblins were now running away scared. Vigna, too, thought that it was a delightful scene. Calling Grace's attention, Galatea informs him that though they made such an effort to make the fence, she points out that one goblin managed to get through. "Oops," says Grace as he guessed that there were just too many goblins. Vigna tells Grace that it is fine as she comments how it is actually a good thing if one or two goblins pass through. Confused, Grace asks why it is a good thing. Smiling, Vigna tells Grace that they need to catch and hang them up. Vigna believes that it will be tough to do a lot at once, but with the device Grace made, it will make the task more easy. Hearing such horrible acts, both Grace and Galatea were speechless. Vigna states that if they catch the goblins little by little and hang them up in order, goblins will never come near their city again, which will make them have the strongest wall ever. Grace tells Vigna that her ideas are as frightening as ever. Grace tells Vigna that they can think about that later, and changes the focus back to his new invention, which he plans in calling as Guardian's Chain. However, Vigna was not on board with the name, calling it a lame name. Galatea tells Grace that it was a wonderful barbed wire, but then corrects herself and changes it to an electric fence. Galatea believes that the new invention will protect their crops from goblin damage. Grace agrees, but then stops, turning to Galatea and asking her about the barbed wire and electric fence. Grace asks what those names were and if what he invented already exists. Surprised, Galatea could only respond, "Eh? Ah." Galatea reveals that her father, Susie, used something similar in his home garden. Later that day, Vigna was surprised and asked Grace what he was doing down on the floor, and reminded him that it was already dinner time. Grace felt down as he assumed that his invention was a groundbreaking idea. Vigna asks Grace if he is still on about that. Galatea appears and apologizes to Grace. Vigna points out that the fault does not lie on Galatea, and that Grace is just moping on his own. Grace wanted to say more about it, but decided to let it go, agreeing to set aside as to who invented the fence for now. Grace then asks the two of them their opinion. stating the mysterious potatoes that restore magical power, technology for creating cheap mithril alloy, and rare monster materials, to which all are novel items. That's right, says Grace as he points out how they've been trying all those things for the betterment of their life in Asgard. But in order for things to go well, Grace believes that they would have to go through external trade. To achieve that step, Grace informs the two that they should be able to raise funds for developments. Now then, says Grace as he and Vigna visited another town to make some negotiations. A map shows the western region of Asgard's territory, the Notrina domain. For daily necessities such as food, building materials, warriors, and amongst other things, Grace and the others needed funds to procure supplies to continue developing Asgard, which has returned to nature, which is why Vigna and Grace are now at Azur Trading Company, which is said to be the largest in Notrina. Here we go, says the head of the Notrina Trading Company as she asks Grace if they should start things now. Offered with the finest herbal tea, Grace thanks the server. Before Grace could have a sip of the tea and thank them for the refreshments, he stopped, as they did not expect that the head of the company would suddenly take and drink it. Grace guessed that the herbal tea was meant for the owner in the first place, which she then asked Grace what had brought them to their company. Removing his hat, the woman confirms that she is indeed dealing with Prince Grace Vermillion, third prince of the Vermillion Kingdom. For their negotiations, Grace wanted for the trading company to purchase some monster materials. Materials, you say? Says the woman, as she happily obliged to take a look at the materials Grace brought. The woman stutters first as she picks up the material and thinks of them as pebbles, and even thought that they would skip well on water. Hearing this, Grace was greatly disappointed. Grace explains that the material he brought are ancient fire dragon scales. Hearing that it came from an ancient fire dragon, the woman scoffs and tells Grace to stop joking around. The woman then told Grace that it is impossible to defeat an ancient fire dragon in Asgard, where the dragons are said to live. The ancient fire dragons are deemed so dangerous that the private soldiers of the trading company can't even go near them. The woman finds it so troubling as she could no longer believe Grace's lies even if he is royalty. Grace asks the woman, confirming if she was truly an appraiser. Grace then informs the woman that he would like for them to properly appraise the materials. "Excuse me," says Grace as he enters a shop. Pleased to make an acquaintance, Grace introduces himself as the Lord of Asgard and wishes to discuss some trade matters. The receptionist looked puzzled after hearing that Grace introduced himself as the Lord of Asgard. The receptionist asks for Grace to wait for a moment, to which Grace thanked the receptionist. As Grace and Vigna sat, he observed the surroundings and found the interior of the shop quite strange. What Grace noticed right away are the walls and ceilings that are made of good materials, but the chairs and tables seem to hastily be put together with cheap items. Seeing some charred spots on the walls, Grace wonders if those were traces of magic. From what Grace thought, the shop looked like they were somewhat attacked by thieves. A man appeared, apologizing to Grace for making him wait. The man then introduces himself as Edward Harrison, the head of the Harrison Trading Company. "It's a pleasure to meet you," says Edward, as Grace responds, likewise, to Edward. Going straight to the point, Grace tells Edward that he came to sell them some items. "Yes, of course," says Edward, and calls for Chris and orders him to bring them some for their two guests. Edward apologizes for their cheap furnishings, but was somewhat puzzled when he saw Grace and Vigna looked extremely pleased. After being handed their teas, Vigna was surprised and told Grace that they were actually offered tea. Grace asks if it was really okay for them to have such warm tea. Vigna notices Chris looking at her, which she then asks what the problem was. Chris explains how she just noticed Vigna's unusual hair color. Chris shares how it is a first for her to see such a color, which surprises her to see how beautiful a light blue hair would look like. Seeing how Vigna stares back at her, Chris notices how Vigna isn't calling her a cursed child and clarifies that she does not care about such a term. Vigna finally spoke, confirming Chris's name and thanking her for the compliment. Vigna shares that it's only the second time that she has been called beautiful. Chris was surprised to hear that she was the second person, making her wonder as to who would be the first person. Looking at how Vigna stared at Grace, Chris immediately understood as to who the first person was. Wanting to clear any confusion, Edward asks Grace if he is truly the Grace who is the third prince of Vermillion. When Grace responded that he is indeed Grace Vermillion, Edward then changed the topic, asking how Bowman is doing. This surprised Grace and he asked Edward if he knew Bowman. Edward reveals that their company was indebted to Bowman in the past. Edward often heard about Grace's achievements through Bowman's letters, but after receiving a letter from Bowman saying that he is headed to Asgard with Grace, Edward then loses contact with Bowman. "I see," says Grace as he shares that Bowman is still as energetic as ever. Hearing that, Edward responded that it was wonderful to hear. Grace never expected that they would receive proper treatment unlike the other companies because of Bowman's connections. With that in mind, Grace was thinking of buying some rare materials for Bowman as a souvenir. Edward asked to be excused as he wishes to start appraising the items Grace had brought. Hearing this, Grace responds, "Please do," In just a matter of seconds, Edward picks up the scale and was astounded, seeing that it was the real deal, an ancient fire dragon scale. Edward admits that he has never seen a genuine ancient fire dragon scale, not since his grandfather's time. Grace too was surprised that Edward could tell that the material is genuine right away. Grace shares how they've been to several trading companies and have been told countless times that the materials they brought were fake. Hearing that, Edward tells Grace that he can't blame the other trading companies for doubting the material, since the very existence of ancient fire dragons is already rare to begin with. The materials are so rare that they may as well be displayed in a museum. Edward also isn't surprised if he was told that they are fake. Grace asks Edward, confirming that he can actually tell that the scale is genuine. Edward responds that he can use one of his skills, which he deemed to be very useless in battle. However, it is one of his few talents that he also deemed useful, his appraisal eye. Changing the topic, since Grace brought genuine materials, Edward asks him if they defeated the monsters in Asgard. When Grace responds that they have and that lots of things happened as well, Edward becomes more intrigued, and finally sees why Bowman praises Grace. Seeing how Edward seemed to have a grasp of the true value of an item, Grace then shows the other items he had brought. Seeing the contents of the case, Edward mutters, "This is..." Grace shares that those are a specialty product from Asgard and wondered if he could sell them to Edward. After thinking about what Grace said, Edward asks Grace if he does not mind him using his appraisal skill on the items. Edward was shocked, as he couldn't believe that the small item he was holding was actual mithril. To be able to process it so small, Edward asks how it was possibly done. Edward even starts to wonder if it was even possible to make such a thing using Bowman's skills. Edward is certain that the item will revolutionize the concept of magical equipment, a true bundle of possibilities. Grace then informs Edward about the potatoes, and suggests that he will understand much faster if he actually tastes them. Grace had already prepared some that were cooked, which Vigna shares that he made into eudaimoni. After receiving the potato from Vigna and taking a bite from it, both Edward and Chris were surprised at how delicious it was. Edward instantly could tell that it wasn't just the taste, as he can also feel his magic power that was depleted by the appraisal eye recovering. Edward never expected that a mere potato could become a new means of recovering magic power besides potions, which he then asks Grace how on earth he created such a thing. Grace apologizes as he could not divulge such a secret. "I see," says Edward, as he offers Grace 50 gold coins for all the materials he brought. Seeing the amount of money on the table, both Grace and Vigna's eyes instantly shimmered. Grace asks Edward if it was really okay to give them that much. Edward reassures Grace that the items he had brought are certainly worth that much. Edward informs Grace that if he were to sell such items regularly, then he would be willing to pay even more. Chris grows concerned, telling Edward about the money. However, Edward reassures Chris that it is all right. Seeing that, Grace asks if there are any problems. Edward responds that it is nothing significant, revealing that the money he offered is all of his current assets. Grace asks Edward if he was sure with his offer and if it wouldn't affect his business. Edward tells Grace that there was no need for him to worry, as he stated that if he can't make a profit with such wonderful products, then he is simply unfit to be a merchant. Grace froze after hearing Edward's words. Edward then informs Grace that if he still has more to offer, he would take them. Grace was beyond grateful, thanking Edward. Grace reveals how they are short on daily necessities and believes that it would be helpful for them if Edward could sell their products regularly. "I see," says Edward as he reassures Grace that he will arrange for that arrangement. After being handed a piece of paper by Grace, Edward asks what it was. Grace informs Edward that the paper shows the safe land route to Asgard. Grace also informs Edward that they are currently recruiting residents and are prepared to accept anyone. With that information, Grace hopes that Edward would spread the word in Notrina that they are looking for immigrants and to give the map to those who are interested. Wanting to respond to Grace's trust, Edward asks Grace if he can shake his hand. After the two shook hands, Edward suggests to Grace that they seal the deal, as he now looks forward to a long and prosperous relationship. With Grace drained from the negotiations, Vigna cheerfully tells Grace, "That's great." Grace too felt the same way, as he admits how he wasn't sure things would turn out. Vigna approaches Edward and Chris, thanking them for taking care of even the smallest details. Edward responds that it was only natural and how they are looking forward to a long-term relationship. Edward whispers, telling Vigna that they too must strive to be cherished by Grace, just like his wife. Hearing that, Vigna turns red as she asks Edward if the wife he is referring to is her. Vigna then informs Edward that he may be misunderstanding something. Puzzled, Edward asks if that was truly not the case. However, Edward stated that it was just what his appraisal skill indicated. Vigna was shocked and asked if even the appraisal eye could tell such information. Chris too was surprised, asking Vigna if Grace and her are not yet dating. "What's with you two?" says Vigna as she tries to explain that her relationship with Grace isn't like that. Chris calls Vigna's name and tells her that she would be happy to help her with anything regarding Grace. Vigna turns to Chris. asking her if she would really do that. Chris reassures Vigna that she will, sharing how love-related businesses are quite profitable. Shocked, Vigna tells Chris that she's got quite the business sense. While Chris is busy interacting with Vigna, Edward approaches Grace, asking for a moment of his time. Grace asks Edward what it is about. Edward first apologizes for disturbing his rest and tells Grace that it is something he wanted to discuss regarding his older brother. Edward shares that in the past, their company had dealings with the second prince, Kyle Vermillion. Since Kyle's approach was one-sided, Edward made it simpler for Grace to understand that they suffered significant loss because of it. Grace finally understands why the place looked as it is, which he then apologizes for his brother's actions. "Not at all," says Edward as he tells Grace that an apology wasn't necessary since the dealings they had with Grace were the complete opposite, which truly excites Edward. From what Edward heard, Kyle is currently on good terms with Azure Trading Company, a large company. Edward believes that the reason is the high-grade potion market, which the company is currently monopolizing. However, if Edward can continue trading with Grace in the future, he believes that it is possible for him to crush the Azure Trading Company. Understanding Edward's plan, Grace too agreed how exciting the future entails for the both of them. With Vigna commenting how the two both look scary, Grace and Edward's business deal then reached its conclusion. Chris appears in front of Grace all beaten up and apologizes to him for making a terrible mistake. Grace was confused at first but was shocked and called out Chris's name after seeing her collapse. An hour before their opening, Grace checked off the things that they needed for the store, which were clothing, spiders, ingredients, paper, books, metals, and various other items. Chris states that all of it completes the goods for the transaction. Grace thanks Chris and apologizes to her for making her come all the way from Notrina. In response, Chris told Grace that she didn't mind, and how it is part of her job. Grace changes the topic, asking her if she came to Asgard by herself. Grace pointed out that even though there's a road, the area is still deemed to be dangerous. This led Grace to believe that Edward is quite the slave driver. Chris reassures Grace that there's no need to worry about that, sharing how she too has talent that is like Edward. Showing a crest on her body, Chris reveals that her talent is a monster-repelling crest. As the name suggests, it's an ability that prevents monsters from attacking Chris. The talent, though, only applies to Chris, which Chris does not deem the talent powerful. However, it is still useful enough which allows her to transport goods without encountering danger when she's alone. Despite Chris's reassuring words, Grace was still worried and asked Chris if Edward didn't tell her to hire adventurers. Chris responded that Edward did inform her, and even received money for it. Hearing this shocked and confused Grace. Chris explains that if she does the task alone, then she would be able to keep the saved personnel costs to herself. Chris then asks Grace to not tell Edward of her secret. Learning of Chris's secret, Grace comments how she is quite the cheapskate. Chris then changes the subject and asks Grace if she has any romantic feelings for Vigna. Grace was shocked and muttered, "Huh?" Grace asks Chris why she suddenly asked such a question. Chris reveals that she only thought of trying some sales pitch to Grace while she was around. Grace was yet again shocked and confused as to why Chris made the question as her sales pitch. Chris showed Grace a brand of necklace that is popular in Notrina currently. Chris pointed out how the necklace had a noble image and is very well received. Looking at the price, Grace was shocked to see how expensive it was. Chris asks Grace what he thought about it and commented how it would suit Vigna. After thinking about it, Grace came to a realization that he had only bought souvenirs for Bowman and had not given anything to the girls. Chris was shocked and asked Grace if he really meant it after hearing Grace ask to purchase 2 of the necklace. Chris got onto her carriage and told Grace that she couldn't stay any longer as she needed to hurry back and prepare the documents. Chris tells Grace that it will take some time for the special order. Back at the present, Vigna tells Chris how she had made quite a mess, which Chris continues to apologize for. Seeing it for himself, Grace deemed it as a major accident. Chris explained how she was in a hurry to get back and ended up crashing the carriage into a tree. Although there were no monsters that would threaten Chris's life, what she didn't expect is that the roads would be in terrible condition. The direct road to Notrina was forcibly made since Grace still didn't have enough money or manpower to maintain it. Grace finds it quite troublesome since, in their current situation, they can't even think about road maintenance. However, Grace still understood that they needed safe distribution routes to make money. Grace thought and wished that they'd have a good solution. Vigna suggested the idea of burning the entire forest, which surprised Grace and commented how it was quite a sudden suggestion. Grace reminded Vigna that there are still many monsters lurking in Asgard forest, to which Vigna responded, "Oh, that's right." Grace thought that there was no point in just thinking about it, as he believes that the World Library would be able to help them in their situation. Opening his World Library, Grace searched for a method about anything they can do with what's in Asgard. With so many pages falling from the shelves, Grace eventually found a page that shows the rubber trees which are growing in clusters around the Mad King's mansion. By adding slime fluid to the rubber tree, they would be able to come up with something. Before Grace could say what it was, Vigna cuts him off, asking him if he is okay. Confused and embarrassed, Grace only muttered, "Huh? Oh." Vigna asks Grace if he was using his talent again, and informs him how scary Grace becomes whenever he suddenly faints like that. Grace too finds it scary after Vigna informed him how he actually looked when going to the World Library. Grace then informs the two that he has found a way to break through their current situation. For their first step, Grace shares that they must obtain slime fluid. Slime? Asks Vigna as she was confused with what Grace needed. The next day, Grace and the others visited the slime colony area within Asgard. Slimes are monsters that voraciously absorb living things and emit a corrosive mucus that dissolves everything weak against magic. Grace, though shocked, was able to block the slime's attack. However, seeing the damage that it could deal to someone like him who does not have offensive magic, Grace relied on Vigna, as he informs her that only magic works on slimes. "Leave it to me," says Vigna, as she charges towards the slime colony. After jumping over the slimes, Vigna then used the Thunder Emperor's arm, Thunderous Rain, to eradicate the slime. With such a powerful attack, the slimes were easily killed off. Galatea, who's holding a bucket, catches all the slime fluids. Galatea calls Grace's attention, telling him that they have gotten a huge haul of slime fluid. Grace asked the two if they were unharmed. Grace thought to himself how he would have sustained grave injuries if it weren't for the shield he was holding. Bowman asks Grace if he too sees how amazing the mithril shield is. Hearing Bowman's voice, Grace turns to respond, but was shocked when he saw Bowman unconscious and covered in slime. Grace didn't expect that Bowman would come and asked him if he had brought a mithril shield for himself. Bowman explained that he only received the order yesterday and that 1 or 2 is his current limit. Bowman asks Grace if he was starting something new. Bowman became curious and came to see what the fuss was about. What Bowman didn't expect is that slime fluid would come raining down on him. Vigna apologizes to Bowman since she was the cause for the slime to be splattered everywhere. "So," says Bowman as he first pointed out Grace coming to the forest, having him make mithril equipment and gathering slimes. With all that, Bowman understood that it was all for the sake of solving the transportation inconvenience that they have. Bowman asks Grace how those things lead to solving the problem. Grace explains to Bowman the process, which the first step was to collect the sap from rubber trees by making cuts from them. By mixing the sap with the slime fluid, they would be able to create a material that is rich in elasticity, which Grace calls rubber. Vigna has never heard of rubber before and asks Galatea if she has some information about it. Galatea responded that she has and revealed that some of her parts are made of rubber, which surprised Vigna and asked Galatea if that is really true. "I see," says Bowman, as he stated that it would no longer matter if the road is rough since Grace will be making a vehicle using the rubber. Grace points to Bowman, praising him for being able to catch on so quickly in his plan. However, the vehicular rubber idea wasn't Grace's real purpose. "Anyway," says Grace as he informs everyone that their immediate goal is to create rubber and how nothing can start until they achieve it. Galatea promises to do her best in supporting Grace. Bowman then asks Grace if he knows the mixing ratio of the sap and the slime fluid. Grace smiles at Bowman, telling him that he has no idea at all. Bowman smiles back as he comments how the journey looks to be going tough. For several days, Grace, along with everyone else, continues to generate latex, which is the solidified tree sap. Galatea would then knead the latex by adding it with slime fluid. Using the material that went through vulcanization, Grace and the others achieved a series of trial and errors for days. Everyone eventually reached their limit and ended up laying on the ground. Exhausted, Grace stated how it was no good and that nothing would work at all. Due to insufficient level, only a rough recipe could be obtained from the World Library. This led Grace to ask why his skills are always like that. With the current information they have, Grace and everyone else will have to keep trying different things, calling it a battle of patience. Galatea then approached Grace and Bowman, asking a moment of their time. Galatea revealed that she has brought them a late-night snack, potato butter. With his eyes glowing, Grace asks if it was okay. Bowman also had thoughts of eating such food at that hour. Grace thanks Galatea for the food as he had some. After taking his first spoonful, Grace comments how it was so comforting. Galatea stated that thanks to the supplies that they got the other day, they've been able to expand their cooking repertoire. As Grace continued to eat the potato butter, he suddenly thought of Vigna and asked Galatea if it was Vigna who made it. Shocked, Vigna peeks at them and asks Grace how he knew. Grace responded that it was just a hunch and asked Vigna why she was hiding. Vigna explains how she has no idea what everyone is currently doing and that making the food was all she could do. Vigna admits that cooking is not her best trait and was really worried that the food might taste bad. "Anyway," says Vigna, as she told everyone that she will be cheering for them and hopes that they would do their best. Grace wiped his face and thanked Vigna. After eating such delicious food, Grace becomes more motivated. Vigna spoke to Galatea since she knows a lot about cooking. Vigna then thanks Galatea for teaching her various things. Galatea felt honored but pointed out how Grace immediately knew who made the food. Galatea then continues to tease Vigna, pointing out the possibility that Grace knew right away because it was Vigna's cooking. Embarrassed and annoyed, Vigna asks Galatea why she is suddenly grinning. Fixing her face, Galatea explains that due to lack of power, some malfunctions may have appeared in her facial expression control system. Hearing that, Vigna thought about how Galatea would only bring up her robot features when it's convenient. Grace and everyone else continued to work at full capacity for a full month. After a long and exhausting process, everyone finally completed their goal. At the Harrison Trading Company, Edward welcomes Grace and thanks him for coming all the way to Notrina. Grace responded how he does not mind visiting Notrina since it was Edward who's always transporting goods for them. After telling Edward that they are even, Grace notices something and asks Edward about the sudden change of atmosphere in the store. Edward responded that there are changes and was glad that Grace noticed it. Edward explained how the products from Asgard have been a huge hit. Edward first mentioned that the potatoes are very popular amongst adventurers as an affordable way to obtain recovery potions that double as food for their journeys. As for the mithril alloy, Edward's store has been receiving bulk orders from the blacksmith guild and weapon shops. Hearing all that, Grace comments how the news sounded great. Grace turns serious and asks about Azure. Edward shares how there has not yet been any particular movement and that there is nothing for them to worry for the time being. Edward states that their advantage of being able to trade with Grace is something that won't be easily shaken. "I've been waiting for this," says Edward, as Grace had told him that there was another product that Edward needs to see. Stepping outside, Chris first asked if it was a new carriage. Edward corrects Chris, asking Grace if the new product he is referring to is the wheels. Grace expected nothing less from Edward, who has the appraisal eye. Grace then introduces his new product to Edward, the rubber tires. Grace believes that seeing is believing, and that it would be much quicker for Edward to understand how amazing it is if he takes a ride. Edward accepts the offer and gets inside the carriage, testing it out near the forest of Notrina. Inside the carriage, Grace explains to Edward that their new product, which is made of rubber, is a material that absorbs shock. By attaching tires to carriages, everyone can achieve stable travel even on rough roads. When Grace mentioned that the carriage can run with a sense of stability, Edward was shocked and asked if drinking tea was possible while standing on one foot. Edward admitted that the ride was indeed comfortable, which he then asks Grace if he plans on selling the tires. "Ah, well," says Grace as he tells Edward that it is not quite it. Grace then pointed out that it was now about the materials for the tires, which he calls slime rubber. Grace wishes to make a contract regarding the rights to the material. Edward asks Grace about the rights and if Grace meant what he is thinking. Grace reminded Edward of one of his carriages that was badly damaged due to the terrible road condition in Asgard. Edward admitted that such an incident happened. Grace explained that they made the carriage with tires to overcome that same situation. However, as long as the roads aren't improved, they can't expand the scale of their business. Since Grace still does not have the funds for road construction, he handed Edward a document. With just one look, Edward immediately understood that it was the method for perfectly manufacturing slime rubber that Grace and everyone else developed for the past few months. In the document, Grace shared that there are also compiled ideas for potential products. Grace wanted to lease the rights to Edward, as they hoped they would wish for Harrison Trading Company to handle the manufacturing and sales. That way, Grace believes that they would expect an increase in sales while keeping physical transactions small scale. With the money gained from leasing the rights, Grace would use it to improve the distribution routes, which would lead for physical transactions to increase as well. After sharing his current plan for the future, Grace asks Chris and Edward about their opinions. Asking for his thoughts, Edward responded that to him, he wanted to be certain that Grace is sure about it. Edward is deeply fascinated with the slime rubber and other product ideas. Edward is also certain that their business scale would reach a whole new level if they were to sell such products. Even without using his appraisal eye, Edward could see the stack of information turning into gold bars. Chris wanted to get straight to the point and asked Grace how their respective shares would be divided. Grace agrees that it is indeed an important point and is open for discussion. However, Grace already had something in mind. Both Edward and Chris were shocked when Grace told them that they will take 20% of the sales and the rest will be for the Harrison Trading Company. With their eyes glowing, both Edward and Chris asked Grace if he was certain of his decision. Grace had already considered the costs of manufacturing and sales. He believes that his proposed division is just fair. Seeing how Edward and Chris react, Grace thought about how the two are wearing their emotions on their sleeves. Edward pointed out to Grace that their transaction is quite a large scale, which meant that they need to be more careful with the contract. Edward suggests that they go back to the shop and have some warm tea, while they carefully work out the details of the contract. Grace smiles and responds, "Gladly." Returning to the shop, the negotiations between Grace and the Harrison Trading Company proceeded smoothly, as both parties agreed to all conditions. which led to the contract being signed. As Grace stood up, Chris called for his attention and handed him the items he requested before. Receiving the box, Grace thanks Chris. Vigna, who witnessed the exchange, calmly observed in silence. While on their way back, Grace states that solving their transportation inconvenience while making money is quite scary, seeing how it is going so well. Vigna asks Grace how many times he has told the story and warns him that if he repeats it again, he will get hit. Grace apologizes to Vigna, but still feels like he needs to brag about it 100 times more. Grace's smile vanishes when Vigna asks him what Chris and he were talking about so happily. Vigna asked Chris about it, but Chris refuses to tell her. Concerned, Vigna asks Grace why Chris and he are keeping secrets. Well, Grace mutters as he thought that situation had turned bad. Grace went to the trouble of preparing a gift, but the atmosphere has become awkward for him to give it. No, says Vigna, as she apologizes to Grace as she believes that it is a matter that Grace can't tell her. Forcing herself to believe that it is fine, Vigna tells Grace that they have to go now. Seeing Vigna's cold reaction, Grace grabs a hold of her and apologizes to Vigna. Grace explains that it was something he didn't want to keep as a secret. Grace blames himself for not having the knowledge to bring up such matters in the situation that they are in. Taking off his hat, Grace hands Vigna a necklace and explains that he bought it from Chris, hoping that it would express his daily gratitude towards Vigna. Grace was planning to properly give it to Vigna another time, but seeing how things escalated for the worse, Grace thought that giving it now was the best option. Receiving the necklace, the first thing Vigna had thought of was a proposal. Vigna then corrects herself as she hears Grace telling her that it was something about his daily gratitude. However, Vigna couldn't believe that Grace would just casually give such an expensive necklace. Vigna remained silent and flustered, wondering what Grace was thinking. Seeing no reaction from Vigna, Grace tries to call her name. Vigna responded that it was nothing and how she was just surprised. After thanking Grace, Vigna asks for him to put it on for her. "Ah, of course," says Grace. Vigna asks for Grace to stop, which puzzles Grace, muttering. Vigna then informs Grace that they have been surrounded. Surprised and flustered, Grace and Vigna asked what was happening and who the people were. Hearing the name Grace, a man asked them if he had heard them correctly. Kneeling in front of Grace, the man asks him if he was truly Grace Vermillion. Seeing this act left Grace speechless and puzzled. The man apologizes for his sudden intrusion and introduces himself to Grace as Agni. Agni explains to Grace that he and another couple of people are looking for a place that will accept them. Agni and the others previously were living in a frontier village along the border with a neighboring country. Unfortunately, a war broke out, which led to them being drifted all the way to Notrina. Grace asks Agni if he had heard of him from Edward. Agni responded that he did, and explained how Edward approached him when he was sitting troubled in the street. "I see," says Grace as he learns that the man has been through a lot. Thinking of accepting refugees, Grace remembers the creed of the country's king, which is, "Strength is everything." It is a common occurrence in Vermillion, which Grace is certain that his grandfather and brothers wouldn't probably even bat an eye at. Grace was distracted by the loud grumbling sound coming from the woman's stomach. The woman apologizes and explains how she tried to keep it quiet. Grace turns to the woman, asking her how many days does it take without food to make such a loud sound. After the woman apologized, Grace knelt in front of the woman and handed her sweets that he got from the trading company, wishing for them to at least eat it. With eyes glowing, the woman asks Grace if it was really okay, to which Grace responded, "Of course." Grace offered some to the boy as well, but the boy looked away and asked for Grace to give everything to Noel. Grace told the boy that his attitude is quite commendable, but then told him that once they return to his domain, there will be plenty of food stockpiled and that there will be no need for him to hold back. The boy ends up accepting Grace's offer and thanked him for it. A man approached Grace, asking him if it meant that they were being accepted. Surprised at how his friend reacted, the bald man could only mutter, "Hey." Grace looks at them and tells them that it is the plan. Grace informed everyone that they are prepared to accept immigrants, which is also the reason why he asked Edward to help with the announcement. Grace brought up the fact that Agni and the others came from a frontier village, which he then asks for their help. Grace guarantees Agni and the others their livelihood, in exchange that they would lend their strength to Grace in developing Asgard. Agni was beyond grateful to Grace and expressed how they are very lucky to have met him. A little embarrassed, Grace responds, "The pleasure is mine, Agni." Grace turns to the two men and asks them if they have any objections, to which the two respond that they do not, and also thank Grace. Turning to Vigna, Grace asks her if they should now return to Asgard. Closing her eyes, Vigna responds, "Yes." After their journey back, Grace and the others eventually reached Asgard. Galatea enters Grace's room, informing him that the immigrants have finished their meals and have now settled down. Calling Grace's attention, Galatea notices that Grace's clothes have changed. Grace responded that he had the clothes tailored in town. Galatea then asked Grace what the papers were. Grace explained that those were names, heights, ages, weights, special skills, and whether the immigrants have a talent or not. Grace used the World Library to thoroughly investigate all the immigrants. Looking at the information he gathered, Grace now understands that much just by touching the subject, like an appraisal skill. What surprised Grace is that Agni had such a hobby, making him wonder if it is also a benefit of leveling up. Galatea comments that Grace is being cautious, to which Grace responds, "Of course." Grace admits that he didn't want to do such tedious work either. But thinking how far they've come so smoothly, Grace thought that he would rather not accept some troublemaker and have everything that they've built fall apart. In his investigation, Grace felt reassured and told Galatea how there was no need for them to worry this time. Grace asked Galatea if they should meet everyone, as Grace also wanted to introduce Galatea to everyone. Galatea thanked Grace as she is certain that everyone would be surprised if she were to suddenly appear. Calling Galatea's name, Grace states how lots of things have happened, which led to Asgard developing to the point that it is now accepting immigrants. From there on, Grace is certain that the development will accelerate. As the second-generation lord, Grace asks Galatea if he would be able to manage it all well, and if he is even able to live up to Susie's expectations. Galatea responds, asking Grace a question about his own opinion. Galatea shares how her father wasn't the type of person to expect anything from others. With Susie having that type of attitude, it is also the reason why the previous Asgard was passive about interacting with the outside world, which flourished on a small scale and then perished. From what Galatea observed, Grace is going in the opposite direction, which is spreading the knowledge and relics of Susie to the outside world. Galatea believes that her father's works and their value are steadily expanding. If Susie were to have witnessed what Grace has done, Galatea believes that her father would have said something along the lines of, "If I were to entrust the future of Asgard to someone, it would have to be you." Hearing that made Grace feel happy. Grace asks Galatea if she thinks so and hopes that she is right. With everyone at the table, Agni stood up and called Grace's name. "Huh," says Grace, as he can see how everyone seemed to have perked up quite a bit. Vignya reminds Grace that it is the result when eating the potato dish. Flexing his muscles, Agni shares that his muscles are now back to their prime. Shocked, Grace was not even able to recognize Agni immediately after his sudden change. Grace first apologizes to everyone for the abruptness and reveals that he has used his talent to thoroughly investigate their backgrounds. Shocked, the man mutters, "Everything?" Grace understands that everyone has their circumstances, but points out that it would be too late if problems arose later, and hopes that they won't take offense. Agni believes that it is natural and that they have nothing to hide, to which he then asks Grace if they had met his standards. Grace responds that they did, which he then shifts to the main point. Based on the information from his talent, Grace wishes to assign roles in Asgard. Calling both Johnny and Alfred's names, Grace brought up how the two have high aptitude and experience in agriculture, which he then gave the news that he will be transferring a portion of land from a nearby village to them, and wished for the two to start farming there. Alfred stood up asking for Grace to slow down, which both Alfred and Johnny asked Grace to confirm if he was truly giving them land. Grace responds that they have plenty of land to spare as of the moment. Alfred asks Grace again if he is certain of his decision. Seeing how Alfred reacted, Vigna asks him if he is that happy, reminding him that the land is still quite barren. Johnny explains to Vigna that in the frontier village they were just laborers for so long that having their own farmland was their own dream. It didn't matter to the two about the condition of the land, as long as they could have it. Alfred could no longer hold his emotions and hugged Johnny, telling him how glad he was that they followed Grace. Vigna told the two that she was happy for the both of them. Grace then turns to Agni, asking him to be the chief carpenter. Grace mentioned that they already have a skilled craftsman, which is Bowman, who used to be a blacksmith employed by the country. Grace wishes for the two to work together on rebuilding the town. Agni never expected that a laborer like him, which is similar to Alfred and Johnny, would become a chief. Agni turned to his side and asked Bowman if he was the blacksmith that Grace was talking about. Bowman responds that it is him, and confirms if he recalled Agni's name correctly. Bowman then asks if he could see Agni's hands. "I see," says Bowman, as he mentioned that Grace's judgment is quite spot on. Agni asks Bowman if he could tell. Bowman tells Agni to not underestimate him, sharing that though he does not have a convenient ability like Grace, he still could tell a lot about a person by their hands. Bowman confirms and tells Agni that he has the hands of a good craftsman. Agni remembers that in over a decade that he has lived at the frontier village, such a thing has never happened before. Agni expressed how touched he really is that he is finally being recognized by someone. Neil calls Grace's attention, expressing how he wished to farm with Alfred and the others and earn a living for Noel. Hearing this, Noel was touched by what his brother had said. For the two siblings, Grace calls Neil's name and tells him that he can't allow that. Shocked, Neil asked Grace why he refused to let him work. According to Grace's talent investigation, if Neil had any talent, it would be with the sword. Grace told Neil that they currently have a few people who can fight. Grace would like to have Neil aim to become a guard. Grace advises Neil to learn swordsmanship from Vigna in his spare time. Grace reassures Neil that despite Vigna's appearance, she is considered the strongest in swordsmanship. Hearing the last comment, Vigna tells Grace that the last part was unnecessary. With his eyes glowing, Neil asks Grace if it was really okay for a commoner like him to learn swordsmanship. Grace responds, "Of course it is." If Neil's wish is to become strong for his sister's sake, Grace believes that it is all the more reason that he chose the path of the sword. Grace then turns to Noel, who excites upon hearing her name. Grace told her that if she does not have any particular preference, he wishes for her to work as a maid in his mansion. Hearing this decision aroused hostility towards the others. Johnny then asks Grace what he is planning by bringing a girl into his mansion. Alfred too was surprised to learn that Grace had such a taste. Hearing this confused Grace even more. Neil pointed out to Grace that Noel is only 14 years old. Noel spoke up and told Neil that it is okay. Though hesitant, Noel accepts to use her body for Grace's sake since he was the one who saved them. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," says Grace as he clarified that everyone is just misunderstanding his decision. Grace revealed that his decision was rooted in Noel's very own aptitude. Grace then shared that Noel has high aptitude for cooking, sewing, and domestic skills. "Oh, I see," says Noel as she remembers that in the frontier village, she used to cook for 100 people by herself. Hearing that, Grace comments that it's incredibly impressive. After sharing to everyone his idea, Grace also mentioned that there's one capable maid in the mansion, and she could help Noel in developing her talents. Grace thought that it would be good for Noel to learn various things from his main household maid. Galatea cheerfully appeared, greeting everyone and introducing herself as the perfect maid robot. Before telling everyone that he looks forward to working with them, Galatea stated that if they have any troubles, just let her know. The first thought that came to Johnny and Alfred is how cute Galatea is. Meanwhile, Neil was quite confused as to what a robot was and what the other things that Galatea mentioned were. Burning from embarrassment, Galatea told Grace that she has followed his instruction on how to introduce herself but believes that she may have fallen flat. "Oh, this is awkward," says Grace, as he then called everyone's attention and shared that Galatea is the crystallization of technology left behind by Susie, the previous king of Asgard. Galatea was shocked to hear when Grace mentioned that she is the living embodiment of cutting-edge technology, deeming her also the strongest maid. After stating Galatea's name, Grace hopes that everyone will remember it well. Embarrassed, Galatea thought that the praise may have been too much. Grace told everyone that Galatea is part of a special race called Robot, and expressed how happy he would be if everyone would get along with her. Noel asks if Galatea is truly not human, while Neil, on the other hand, thought that the word robot itself sounded cool. Alfred also approaches Galatea, greeting her. Galatea was caught off guard as she felt somewhat nostalgic after meeting other people. Agni realized that the rumors about Grace, who had inherited Susie's relics, were true after all. Grace then introduces himself again properly, telling everyone that he is Susie's successor and the current Lord of Asgard, Grace Vermillion. Raising his cup, Grace told everyone that moving forward, they are free to live in Asgard with peace of mind. As their lord, Grace swore to ensure their safety and prosperity. On that day, Grace welcomes immigrants for the first time and has taken a new step forward as a lord. At the same time in the royal capital, the second prince Kyle was laughing after learning that Grace was still alive. The man confirmed that it is true and shared how Grace approached their Azure trading company to deal in monster materials and such. The man reassures Kyle that he had brushed Grace off. Kyle laughs as he finds it amusing, the thought that a royal would be playing as an adventurer. But what still surprises Kyle is Vigna, who went along with Grace. Kyle admits that Vigna is an excellent knight, despite being a cursed child. Kyle guesses that Vigna is now Grace's lifeline. When the man mentioned that Grace had started some strange business, Kyle responded that he had already heard of it. Learning of magic restoring potatoes and mithril alloy, Kyle finds it hard to believe that anything other than potions can restore magic power. Kyle then points out that Azure Trading Company already has control of the potion business, which is why he isn't interested. However, Kyle is very much interested in the mithril alloy and plans to seize it when the time is right, just like what they did with the Harrison Trading Company. "Indeed," says the man, as he brought up how Kyle took the potion business from the Harrison Trading Company and gave it to Azure Trading Company. Thanks to Kyle's help, Azure Trading Company is now thriving. Kyle told the man how it sounded quite unpleasant, pointing out that he simply entrusted a business too big for a small company to a larger one. For Kyle, it is only natural if they wish for their country's development. Kyle believes that he has the most qualities befitting a king and how no one seemed to understand how far behind the others are to him. Kyle mentions that his older brother Georg and younger brother Grace, as well as their father, are no longer on par with him, which led him to believe that he may have to demonstrate to them once more that he is superior. To prove his superiority, Kyle decides to start it off with Grace. Vigna was amazed and asked Noel if she made the entire dinner. Vigna comments on how the prepared meals were something she has never eaten before, but yet are so delicious. Grace also commented on how the spices are strong, giving it a unique flavor. Grace then praises Noel for making an incredible dish and asks her what the deal was with the cuisine. Noel explains that what she cooked is something that is called Chinese cuisine that has been passed down in Asgard. Noel made the food while learning various things from Galatea. Hearing that Noel is confident in the food's taste, the first thing Grace noticed is how tiny Noel's voice is. Hearing her name being called surprised Noel. Galatea then appeared, pointing out how her voice is too quiet and reminded her that a maid's duty is to respond clearly to what is asked or requested. Galatea then made it clear that knowing how to cook isn't just enough. When Noel heard that she had failed as Galatea's student, she immediately apologized and reassured Galatea that she can do better. Hearing a loud response, Galatea praises Noel and tells her that she can surely do it if she tries. Grace asks Galatea what she is doing. After being entrusted with Noel's education by Grace, Galatea took it upon herself to carry out the duty with all of her might. For the sake of Noel's education, Galatea is determined and believes that her hot-blooded Spartan sadistic female teacher Guts education program is appropriate. Vigna asks Galatea what she is talking about and if it is one of Susie's hobbies. Grace wonders as well why such a program even existed and not a program for farming. Confused, Galatea apologizes and responds that she does not quite understand what the two are talking about. Galatea then changes to a more important topic and tells Grace that a letter has arrived for him. From what Galatea could tell, the letter came from Edward from Notrina. Vigna asks if the letter was an invitation to a party, which she finds pretty casual. Vigna remembers that the Harrison Trading Company is in a dispute with the Azura Trading Company at the moment and wonders if a party is really appropriate at this time. No, says Grace, as he believes that what Vigna mentioned is the exact reason why a party must be held. Grace explains that they require merchants to gather together to strengthen their unity and to also stand against the powerful Azur. A few days later, Chris appears and introduces herself as the one who will pick up the guests. Surprised and puzzled, Chris asks Grace and Vigna if it will just be the two of them that are coming. Grace explains how they are quite busy as of the moment, but still didn't want to refuse an invite that came from Edward. I see, says Chris, as she then asks if the immigrants who went to Asgard are doing well. Grace responds that they are, and also comments that the immigrants are all excellent. Grace shares that the collapsed village has been completely cleaned up and is now ready for repairs. Grace also shared how his craftsmen even had the leisure to make incomprehensible buildings. Another good news from Asgard is that they also were able to start farming in the village. With the synergy of Bowman's hoe, Grace is certain that they will be expecting a considerable potato harvest next season. Chris remembered that there were children immigrants as well and asked how the two were doing. Grace responds that one of the kids is working as a maid in the mansion. As for the other one, Grace stopped speaking as he let Vigna take the turn since she was Neil's instructor. Vigna reassures them that Neil is doing his best, which is also what Grace heard. Hearing such wonderful praises, Chris comments on how it sounded great. Vigna then turned quiet as she was asked not to give out any details. During Neil's training, he was wet from the rain while promising to become strong in order to protect not just his sister, but everyone as well. Another thing Neil asked for Vigna to keep as a secret was how he cried during training. Chris then reminded the two that the party is tomorrow and asked if they had prepared their formal wear. Grace responded that they had brought something, but it is the clothes they brought from the royal capital and is certain that the clothes might be a bit wrinkled. Edward suddenly appeared and told Grace that what he brought just won't do at all. Putting his arm around Grace, Edward then told him how clothing is life for a gentleman. Edward drags Grace as he promises to introduce him to a good formal wear shop. Seeing Grace taken away so easily, Vigna could only stare at him in silence. Chris then calls for Vigna's attention and asks for them to speak. Chris reassures Vigna that they will just be talking and shares how she wishes for Grace to stand out as much as possible during tomorrow's party. Vigna is quite certain that Grace would just stand out naturally. Chris pointed out that there's a limit to how much one person can stand out at a large party. Chris reveals that the purpose of the party is to widely promote the Lord of Asgard, who is their main trading partner. Chris suggests strengthening their unity to counter Azur, and for that to happen, they wish to borrow Asgard's power as well. Sipping her drink, Vigna thought that it is exactly what Grace also said. Vigna understands that it is all for promotion and asks what the method is, and clarifies with Chris that she is not good with difficult talk. Chris reassures Vigna that there's nothing for her to worry about, as they already have an idea. The goal for the party was simple, and that is to leave an impression on the guests no matter what. Chris opens a cabinet and tells Vigna that there is only one method to use at a party venue. Vigna's eyes sparkled as she asked Chris what she was seeing. Chris responded by asking Vigna what she thought it was, revealing the first-class item the Harrison Trading Company prepared just for her. Vigna then asks if Grace knew about the plan. Chris is certain that Edward is telling Grace the exact same thing right now. Vigna remembers how Chris had once told her before that she would help her out and asked Chris if that is what she meant. Chris responds, "Well, who knows?" The next day, Edward welcomed the merchants of Notrina and thanked them for accepting his invitation. Edward informs his guests to feel free to enjoy the food or let themselves be carried away by the music and dance. Edward also allows for the merchants to start business negotiations if they wish to do so, and hopes that they all enjoy the finest evening. The guests couldn't close their mouths as they were mesmerized by Vigna's beauty. Seeing Vigna approaching someone, the others immediately made a connection that the other person is none other than the Lord of Asgard, Grace. Walking beside Grace, Vigna states how they seem to be famous and are standing out really well. "Of course we stand out," says Grace, as he remembers how he was forced to buy extremely expensive formal wear in all the commotion and believes that they must stand out that much. Vigna praises Grace's suit, telling him how it suits him. Grace thanks Vigna, responding to her compliment by telling her how she looked beautiful. Vigna points out how it is embarrassing when Grace says it directly but still thanks him for it. Hearing the music starting, Vigna asks Grace if he already has heard what they needed to do. Grace responds that he does and calls for Vigna's name, asking her for a dance. "Of course," says Vigna as she delightfully accepts Grace's hands. The two were requested to stand out with their dancing, to which the two also agreed that Edward was asking too much of them. Grace remembers how it has been a while since they last danced together and how Vigna used to help him practice a lot in the past. "Yes," says Vigna as she states how it brings back memories before she became Grace's knight. Vigna was an orphan and did not know her parents' faces or names and was just abandoned by them one day. Vigna heard that someone from the orphanage had taken her in. Vigna wondered why she was abandoned, but later learned and understood the reason. A nun calls for Vigna, handing a couple of coins and telling her that it was her allowance and to use it wisely. Unable to voice any concern, Vigna accepted the money and thanked the nun. After giving the allowance, the nun then left immediately. Vigna then covers her head as the reason why she was abandoned was because of her hair color. The tale of the blue-haired cursed child who caused magical power to run amok. Even though it was just a tale, amidst such a life, there was only one thing Vigna looked forward to: using the allowance she earned by helping the sisters with their work. Once a month, Vigna would buy her favorite sweets. Opening the store's door, Vigna makes her presence known, calling for the shop owner and asking for her usual cookies. Vigna was shocked when she was suddenly pushed and told to stay outside as she can't enter the store right now. With tears in her eyes, Vigna mutters, The shop owner then apologizes to his other customer and explains that they don't usually let cursed children in. Says the customer, who had turned out to be a young Grace, who then asked if the shop chooses its customers. Grace was not surprised why the shop isn't thriving, despite it being already such a small store. The shop owner tries to defend himself but could not construct a proper sentence. Grace tells the shop owner that a person's true nature comes out at crucial moments, a comment that angers the shop owner. Grace stepped outside and mentioned Vigna's hair. While Vigna hurriedly fixes her hair, Grace comments how he finds it interesting since he has never seen it before and has only read about it in books. From what Grace learned, those who possess excessive magical power have their hair changed to a color never seen before. "Interesting?" says Vigna as she asked Grace if it was sarcasm. Vigna let out her frustration and told Grace that everyone is scared of her hair, and how thanks to it she does not have a single friend. Filled with anger, Vigna states that there's nothing interesting about her hair. Grace responds that people are afraid because they lack knowledge. Grace then asked Vigna if she knew that in the past few hundred years only a handful of blue-haired people caused magical power to run amok. Grace then shares his thoughts on how beautiful the rumored blue hair is. Hearing that, Vigna knew that it was the moment of her turning point. At first, due to how rare her hair color is, Vigna hired Grace as a servant to the royal family. At the same time, magic and swordsmanship are normally permitted to those of high stats. Despite Vigna's status, Grace allowed her to train in those as well. Vigna wanted to become strong enough to be Grace's sword. Back at the present time, Vigna is focused on achieving their goal, and that is to make Grace stand out. The brilliance of a sword illuminates its wielder, the sword that shines brightest on him, and that is how Vigna describes herself when she's with Grace. As the two continued their dancing, Edward proudly praised the two, saying, "Magnificent," and asked if it was the sight of a first-rate king and his knight dancing. Edward then formally announced Grace as the Lord of Asgard, who also had the rights to the Vermillion throne succession. Alongside Grace, Edward too introduced Grace's knight Vigna. Edward proudly announced that the two are his business partners like everyone else and vows that one day, Grace would help in defeating their greatest rival, the despicable Azur. Edward then asked for everyone to give Grace and Vigna a round of applause. Grace then called Vigna, telling her that he does not have good memories of parties. In the royal capital, Grace often attended just to make his brothers look good. What disappointed Grace also is that the dance he and Vigna practiced was not even allowed to be performed. In today's party, it was the first time Grace showed the dance that they practiced in the past. Grace thought that the dance went well because Vigna was his partner. Grace happily thanked Vigna for being his partner. Hearing those words made Vigna's face turn red. Inside the bathroom, Vigna stares at herself in the mirror, asking herself what she should do about it. Vigna thought how she won't be able to face Grace properly tomorrow. Vigna thought that since it was a large-scale party, not everyone is acquainted with Edward. With that in mind, Vigna decides on changing quickly and returns to his original role, which is to guard Grace. From what Vigna remembered, Grace has told her that he will wait in the reception room after changing. As Vigna was about to open the door, she stopped when she heard voices inside. From what Vigna heard, the person inside the room asked for the matter to be handled carefully, and so that Vigna wouldn't find out. Hearing the voice, Vigna immediately recognizes it as Edward. Vigna froze as she heard that the people inside are planning on taking Grace along and even wondered what kind of face Grace would make, which makes the perpetrators more eager to complete their plans. After hearing suspicious plans to take Grace, Vigna follows Edward. To Vigna's surprise, she reaches the Neutrina branch, Cabaret Club Elf Villa. As the elves welcome their guests, Edward, who is enjoying his drink, tells Grace that it is his treat and tells Grace that he can drink to his heart's content. Grace is unable to speak as a group of beautiful elves shower him with praise upon learning that he is a really important person. With his face turned red, Edward tells Grace how he is just so popular. Edward then calls another elf named Sarah and asks her to get Grace another refill, says Sarah as she stated what she should do, and if Grace really insisted, then she would bring it over. Please, says Grace while his eyes are now spinning. Seeing Grace's reaction, the elves find it cute how Grace is acting all shy. Unbeknownst to the two, Vigna is angrily observing them, as she can't believe that she was left behind and that Grace is now acting all lovey-dovey. Peeking through the small opening at the door, Vigna realizes that the people inside are all important figures among merchants, like heads of trading companies. Vigna also realizes that the after-party at the Cabaret Club is the actual main event. Vigna wonders if the place is the grand stage where business deals are made. One of the guests calls an elf named Maria, pointing out how her butt has gotten even bigger. Seeing that makes Vigna doubt what she had initially thought. The man then tells Grace that the elf, Maria, gets hotter every time he sees her, which he believes is worth visiting for that reason alone. Embarrassed, Maria responds, "Oh, stop it." With Grace all flustered, the elves then mention how Grace is staring too much. Maria hints that since there is something to look at, a man would instinctively look, as it is within their nature. Since Grace is already present, Maria asks Grace if he wishes to touch it. Grace is too shocked and couldn't even respond properly, saying, "No, Maria then announces that touching time is over. Seeing all that, Vigna closes her eyes and thinks that Grace should do it, as it is part of the business deal. Vigna tries to force herself to believe that the people inside are just having stupid conversations and nothing else. Sarah calls for Grace's name and asks if she had gotten it right. After Sarah introduces herself, she asks Grace if it is his first time visiting such a place. When Grace asks Sarah why she is asking, Sarah responds, pointing out how Grace seems nervous and like something is bothering him. In a seductive approach, Sarah offers to lend her ear and listen to Grace. Surprised, Grace asks Sarah if it is that obvious. Sweating, Grace reveals that it is about a friend. Grace explains how his friend doesn't understand his feelings for his childhood friend. With that thought in mind, Grace's friend said how his childhood friend is rough and stupid but is kinder and works harder than anyone else. Grace momentarily slips, referring to himself, but then changes the subject to his friend and mentions how he is always focused on work. Meanwhile, Vigna is still peeking from the outside but couldn't hear what was being talked about. Grace, who keeps referring to himself as his friend, states that he never thought about such a thing before but now finds himself thinking about his friend. Listening to Grace, Sarah tells Grace that the problem is that his friend does not understand his own feelings, which is quite simple to discern. "Huh," Grace responds. Sarah then asks for Grace to imagine if he were his friend, and the girl ends up with someone else, which Sarah then asks how Grace would feel. Grace freezes from the thought that Vigna would be in someone else's arms. In Grace's head, Vigna is in the arms of another man, stating how she preferred strong men like Kyle. Sarah is more puzzled as to why the people in Grace's imagination are naked. Too shocked by his own imagination, Grace ends up falling from his chair, which surprises Sarah, who says, "Hey Grace." Sarah then tells Grace that if what he imagined shocked him so much, then he has his answer. Realizing Sarah's point, Grace responds, "Ah, I see." Looking at Sarah, Grace remembers that he had left Vigna behind. Edward then calls for Sarah, asking for her to bring him another drink. "Yes, coming," says Sarah. Grace apologizes to Edward as he decides to take his leave first. Drunk, Edward asks Grace if he is leaving already, to which Grace responds that he is and thanks him for everything. Opening the door, Grace explains that something has come up. At that moment, Grace notices Vigna hanging onto the door. After closing the door, Grace asks Vigna what she is doing. Vigna explains how she saw Grace being taken away by Edward. As Grace's bodyguard, Vigna thought that something bad may have happened, so she decided to follow them and keep watch. With her face turning red, Vigna asks Grace if he is mad. Grace responds that he is not, and admits that he is in the wrong. After thanking Vigna, Grace apologizes to her for leaving her behind. Extending his hand out, Grace suggests that they go home now. Vigna is speechless as she did not expect such an action from Grace. "Okay," says Vigna as she holds Grace's hand. Curious as to what was being talked about inside the cabaret, Vigna tells Grace that she couldn't hear much of what was said inside and asks him why he stumbled at the end. "That's, says Grace, as he is not quite sure how to explain it to Vigna. Meanwhile, at the Azure Trading Company, the owner is pissed off at the Harrison Trading Company for hosting a grand party without informing her. Sabus states that such an action is quite insolent, and asks the owner what they should do. The owner remembers that Sabus went to the royal capital recently and asks what Kyle said. Sabus relays what Prince Kyle said, that as long as the merchandise is safe, then they can do as they please. "I see," says the owner, as she is certain that there is nothing for them to fear as long as they have Prince Kyle's backing. The owner then informs the cursed dragon tamer, Rufus, that it is now time to work. A month after the large party in Neutrina, about 20 new immigrants have come to Asgard. Grace heard that Agni has been gradually recruiting his comrades who were scattered by war. A bearded man approached Grace and said that he had heard lots of good things about Grace from Agni, and promises Grace that they will be as useful as Agni. "More rough-looking folks have arrived," says Grace. The man is called Donovan and introduces himself as a coal miner related to Agni. Donovan also has a talent, boasting the work efficiency of 100 people as a coal miner. Grace was expecting such a day to come, when immigrants with talents, which is a group of coal miners, would come to his territory. If they were to secure their own metal supply, Bowman's capabilities would certainly increase and would lead to further development. Hearing a woman call his name, Grace turns and sees his acquaintance, Sarah. Grace greets Sarah as it has been a while since the last time they met at Asgard. Grace asks if the club is okay. Sarah responds that she is just on vacation. Sarah heard that there would be a group of immigrants headed to Asgard and decided to tag along and think of it as a trip. "With such a casual attitude," says Grace. Sarah then moves in closer and brings up the girl Grace mentioned, in which Sarah reveals that it has become quite the hot gossip. Noticing how close the two were, Vinya states how the two seem to get along well, and wonders if she should go over there instead. Turning her attention to Vinya, Sarah asks for some time to speak privately. After leaning forward and whispering into her ears, Vinya's face immediately turns red, which alarms Grace after seeing her face. After dropping such a secret, Sarah then tells the two that she will be under their care for a few days, and that they may rely on her if trouble arises. Seeing Sarah leave, Grace wonders what Sarah whispered to Vinya. With nothing left to do, Grace mentions that they will be heading back to the mansion now. Vinya is surprised and says, "Yes, that's right." Grace gathers his retainers at their home and informs them of the situation, which is that he is planning to go to the mine. Grace is certain that everyone heard that a group of coal miners came as immigrants the other day. According to the World Library, there is a mine in the northeast mountains of Asgard. Grace is thinking of going there with the coal miners. After asking for their opinion, the door suddenly opens and Bowman asks Grace if he really plans on going there by himself. With a scary look, Bowman asks that he too be brought along. Grace is shocked to see Bowman and asks if he was up all night. Realizing that he got caught, Bowman explains that he was doing some experiments in the workshop. When Grace asked about the experiments, Bowman interrupted and told him that there was a more important matter. Bowman stated that the metals available in Neutrina are of poor quality. Since Grace is going to the mine in their territory, Bowman wanted to go as well. Sensing the murderous sensation coming from Bowman, Grace stated that Bowman did not have to tell him that as he was planning on it. Removing her glove, Galatea informs Grace that the mines in Asgard are places his father used before and that she has detailed maps in her memory. Galatea shares that there are many monsters in the surrounding area and that it would be logical for her to accompany them as a guide and guard. Enticed by the technology Galatea is showing, Grace tells her how their maid is quite reliable. Vinya then asks Grace what about her. While thinking about what job to assign her, Vinya tells Grace how she is more suitable for protection. Grace says no and explains that for this time Galatea is more suitable since she can also guide them. Grace orders Vinya to protect the village's safety as they need at least one person with high combat ability to remain. "I see, that's right," says Vinya. Approaching Galatea, Vinya asks if she can ask her something, as she had been wondering about it. When Galatea asks what it was, Vinya outright asks her who she thinks would win in a fight between the two of them. After finishing her analysis, Galatea shares with everyone that according to simulation results, she would win 99% of the time. Galatea explains that, as a made combat robot, she has been given powerful resistance to slashing attacks and magic. Putting it in simpler terms, Galatea is a bad matchup for Vinya. After hearing that from Galatea, Vinya turns away and reassures them that she will guarantee the village's safety. Bowman asks Vinya to wait and tells her that the prototype from the experiment is in the underground workshop, and that she may try it out for herself. Vinya responds, "I understand," before leaving the room. Bowman turns to Grace and asks him if he is not going to chase after her. "It's fine," says Grace, as he also understands Vinya's feelings. Vinya has always been Grace's royal guard, protecting him as a prince, but now Grace is not just a prince. Grace also holds the position of a lord, responsible for everyone's lives. That is also the reason why he cannot afford to make a single mistake in his choices, and he believes that the decision he made is the best one. Grace then orders the two to call for Donovan, and tells them to stop looking so gloomy. Grace smiles and reminds them that it will just be a short trip and not their last day or anything. Hearing that from Grace, Bowman tells him that he has truly grown up. "Have I?" says Grace. The next day, a group of dragons were headed to Asgard. A person riding the dragon commented on how puny Asgard looked. At the same time, at the northeast mine of Asgard, Grace and the others had made it very far with Galatea's guidance. However, the path they took was so pitch black that they could no longer see where they were headed. Galatea suggested making her eyes glow to give them some light. Everyone was shocked and asked her if she could really do that. Galatea responded that she could not and that she was merely joking. This angered the others, and they told her that it was no time for jokes. The group then asked each other if they had a light. Grace called for Donovan, asking if he was nearby, to which Donovan responded that he was. Bowman called everyone brats and told them to quiet down. Bowman then lit up a spare light and ordered them to wait. After turning on the light, it woke up the sleeping bats inside. Everyone screamed as huge bats started coming at them. Galatea stepped forward, saying to leave it all to her. This shocked Donovan, and he immediately turned to Grace, asking him if letting the maid go was okay. Another concern of Donovan was that they were not capable of handling flying monsters. With the situation becoming scarier than what he had heard, Donovan's view of Asgard was now that it was terrifying. Grace ordered Donovan to calm down and just watch. Grace then shared with him that in Asgard, maids could fly too. Donovan was in shock as he witnessed how Galatea jumped so high and landed a kick onto the huge bat. Aside from being able to kick the flying monster, Galatea then swung the defeated giant bat to take out all the others, which Donovan found absurd. Donovan was impressed with Galatea. Although he already knew that Galatea was not human, he still did not expect her to have such combat capabilities. Donovan was very grateful for Galatea, telling her how they would have been wiped out without her. Galatea liked the praise very much and asked to be praised more. With Galatea's kind of power, she was asked if she could not develop the mine in an instant. Galatea explained that it was impossible, as she was not programmed with coal mining skills. However, Galatea would instead focus on cheering for all of them. Donovan was very confused with what Galatea said but thought that it was fine since she was cute. With the place cleared of monsters, the miners started working. Grace informed everyone that for the day they would just be doing some light surveys, and there was no need for them to dig deep. Donovan then called for Grace's attention, showing him the minerals he had collected. All of it was just from a bit of digging, and Donovan was expecting to gather more since they were mining in a monster-infested area. Grace was also shocked for them to find so much mithril in such little time. Grace calls Bowman's attention, asking him the status on his end. Bowman responds that it was all waste rock. When Bowman tells Grace to throw it away since it is just worthless ore and cannot be sold or used, Grace opens his book and tells Bowman to wait since the world library is reacting. When Bowman asks what it means, Grace responds that he has encountered knowledge from another world again. Grace encounters a magic stone and is then informed that it can store magic. Bauxite is another mineral that Grace finds that is used as a raw material for aluminum in another world. By encountering bauxite, Grace's understanding of the other world has increased. Grace also unlocks the recipe for aluminum. Bowman becomes intrigued by a raw material that is widely used in another world, and a mineral that is meaningless without magic. Grace was not surprised that he did not know about it, as only a very few can use magic. Bowman, on the other hand, still could not believe that such minerals existed. With his eyes glimmering, Bowman tells himself that coming along was the right decision. Donovan approaches Grace, asking him if he is also knowledgeable about minerals. After being a coal miner for years, Donovan admits that the minerals that Grace spoke about are something he has never heard before. From the knowledge Grace shared, Donovan now thinks that Asgard is full of amazing people. Grace tries to explain that he is not knowledgeable but rather that it is just his talent. Galatea calls Grace's attention, informing him that they have an emergency. After being told that the village was on fire, Grace looked shocked and pale, while the others were also processing the information. Taking a closer look, Donovan and Bowman still doubted it, as they couldn't see a thing. Grace asked Galatea what type and how many enemies they have. With her enhanced eyes, Galatea learned that there were a total of 5 wyverns, and one that seemed to be their tamer. The first thing that comes to Grace's mind is whether it is a dragon tamer. Grace believes that if they take down the leader, the wyverns will scatter. Grace also does not think that their enemies are a match for Vinya. Donovan asks Grace if he will be alright since they are facing 5 wyverns. Donovan also tells Grace that they have to do something fast, or Agni and the others would also face the consequences. Bowman reassures everyone that there's no need for them to worry, sharing with them that Vinya has a new weapon. Bowman believes that even 10 wyverns wouldn't be a match against Vinya. Grace is shocked to hear that Vinya has a new weapon since he hasn't heard anything about that. The reason why Grace didn't know about it is because Bowman did not inform him. Bowman points out that he wasn't hiding it and thought that it just wasn't the right time since Grace is so busy with parties and whatnot. Also busy with his own work, Bowman didn't get the time to mention it to Grace. Bowman had already told Vinya about the weapon, which is the crystallization of all the technology they've cultivated so far. The weapon is a fusion of technology from another world and their world. Upon showing the weapon to Vinya, Bowman suggests that she try it out. Vinya was quite hesitant about using the new weapon. A little while earlier at the Mad King's mansion in Asgard, Vinya understood that Galatea is much more suitable for the trip than she is. However, Vinya felt conflicted, since she had always been Grace's bodyguard. Saying such things and causing trouble, Vinya stated how she has started to hate herself. Crying on Sarah's lap, Vinya wonders if Grace is starting to hate her. Unsure of what to do, Sarah could only mutter Vinya's name. Vinya then reminds Sarah that she had agreed to listen to her cries. Shedding a tear herself, Sarah apologizes and mentions that it is just troublesome. However, Sarah thinks that Vinya is still better than the dangerous customers at the club. Sarah reassures her that she is already used to that kind of thing. Vinya also apologizes for her behavior and mentions that it is easier for her to share it with Sarah. Sarah points out to Vinya that if Grace starts hating her over something like that, then he would be the one with the problem. Sarah then asks Vinya if the man she fell for is that small-minded. Embarrassed, Vinya looks away and clarifies that her feelings toward Grace are not that serious. The answer only angered Sarah, and she thought that their conversation had started to become a pain. Vinya stated how she was just so confused by all the emotions she was feeling, and that all she wanted was to protect Grace more than anyone and always be by his side. Listening to Vingda, Sarah tells her that what she feels is what they call love. Vingda was shocked when Sarah revealed that she had seen her when she was peeking through the window at the club earlier. Sarah asks Vingda if she really thought that she wouldn't notice and even brought up how the two held hands while leaving. Sarah asks her if there has been any progress since then. As for progress, Vingda thought that just by holding hands it made her heart race. Hearing that only made Sarah angrier. Sarah asked if that was all that happened, curious if there was kissing and stuff involved. Vingda turns red, as she didn't expect that kiss would be brought up. Vinya believes that a kiss is only something that lovers do. Vinya also pointed out that she is a knight and Grace is a prince, which meant that a relationship could never happen. Vinya looks confused when Sarah asks her what she is talking about. Sarah revealed that she already knew about Vinya's situation from Agni and the others. Sarah then stated that an exiled prince and the royal guard who followed him both gave up their positions to come to Asgard. Sarah then asks Vinya if it's still necessary to worry about being a knight and a prince at this point. Neil entered the room, looking panicked. He then called for Vinya and told her that something terrible had happened. Surprised, Vinya reminded Neil that he should knock before entering. Realizing his mistake, Neil apologizes. When Neil informs Vinya that there is an emergency, Vinya asks what happened. Neil informs the two ladies that a flock of wyverns has breached the Guardian's chain and is now invading their territory. The two ladies were in shock. Picking up her sword, Vinya then hands it to Neil and tells him that she will be entrusting it to him. The weapon is a mithril magic sword and should be able to cut through wyvern scales. Vigna advises Neil to use the weapon to protect Noelle and everyone else. Dumbfounded, Neil asks Vigna if it was really okay, as the weapon is a symbol of a royal guard and also Vigna's pride as a teacher. Vigna reassures Neil that it is fine, and then thanks Sarah as she has now made up her mind. Sarah responds, telling Vigna that she is not asking for anything, but only hopes that she comes back safely. Vigna remembered that the prototype from the experiment Bowman developed was left in the underground workshop and that he had told her to try it out whenever she felt like it. Vigna never thought that Bowman would look out for her. Vigna was stuck, unable to move forward and trapped by her position as a royal guard. After seeing what was happening to Vigna, Bowman had shut himself in for days and even went as far as making something for her. The weapon Bowman is trying to show to Vigna is a magic gunblade, a weapon Bowman created based on Grace's weapon. Due to its structure, only those who can use magic can wield it. The weapon has a blade made of high-purity mithril alloy and can also fire mithril alloy bullets. By imbuing the bullets with magic, it can create cluster bomb-like effects, greatly increasing the range and power of magic. Picking up the gun, Vigna stated that she could no longer call herself a knight anymore. However, that is also exactly why the gun is the perfect weapon for who she is now. Relinquishing her position as a royal guard, Vigna accepts that she will just be the plain old her. Using the Thunder Emperor's skill, Vigna casts Luring Light. After getting the attention of the wyverns, Vigna proceeds to chant her spell, burning and freezing the wyverns with the Great Ice Fire Lance. Seeing a wyvern escape, Vigna steps back as she realizes that she had missed one. The wyvern then turns its focus to the mansion. Wanting to protect everyone, Neil steps in and stabs the wyvern beneath its head. Able to buy time for her, Vigna then finishes the wyvern off by cutting its head. Vigna then pulls the sword out and hands it to Neil, telling him to hold it steady. Vigna then praises Neil, revealing to him that she couldn't face a dragon when she was the same age as him. The man then approaches Vigna, impressed with how Vigna lured the wyverns with a strong light containing the magical energy that they preferred. The man then points out how Vigna took them all out with ice magic, which was the wyvern's weakness. Since wyverns are very rare, the man asks Vinya how she knew of such a niche countermeasure. Vinya swings at the man, telling him that she studied. Vinya still couldn't believe that a tamer would come out so carelessly, and believes that it is the man who needs to read more books. The man explains that he was intrigued by Vinya's blue hair, as he stated that it is also quite rare to meet one of his kind. Kicking Vinya off of him, the man asks Vinya if she has the same constitution as him. "So what if I do?" says Vinya. Licking his wound, the man then tells Vinya that controlling a mere handful of wyverns does not begin to deplete his magical power. Releasing so much power, the man reveals his talent as a dragon tamer and summons a dragon that he had previously marked. Against opponents with strong magic, the man's solution was just to summon a dragon that is immune to magic. Facing a new threat, Vinya was shocked to learn that a dragon immune to magic exists. Since it is the first time Vinya has heard of such a being, she now wonders how she would have to deal with it. Vinya tells Neil that she will be the one handling the dragon. She also points out that if they defeat the summoner, the dragon would return to normal. Vinya then asks Neil to take care of that and counts on him. Picking up the sword, Neil agrees with the plan and reassures her that he can do it. "Good boy," says Vinya. Annoyed, the man tells Vinya and Neil to stop whispering to each other. He then follows it with an order to his earth dragon to strike. Vinya and the others had fought an armadillo immune to magic before. In defeating the armadillo, Galatea pried open its armor and eventually won by using magic. However, in Vinya's current situation, she wonders if they could even stand a chance against a dragon that is immune to magic. Seeing Vinya being crushed, Neil becomes worried and momentarily looks away. This gives his enemy a chance to sneak up on him, even asking Neil if he should really be looking away. The man kicks Neil, but Neil is able to guard in time, minimizing the damage. The man is very much impressed and sees potential within Neil. However, Neil is still no match for him. The man asks Neil if he truly believes that he would win in hand-to-hand combat against him just because he is a summoner. Looking down on Neil, the man asks him if he believes that a weakling could be a tamer. Pissed off, Neil charges at the man and tells him to never underestimate him. Unfortunately for Neil, his attack is easily stopped with a knee to the face. With Vinya's new weapon on the ground and Neil unable to match up with the tamer, the two are now facing near defeat. The man realizes that Vinya used self-enhancement magic to increase her defense and endurance, and lets her know that he has seen her technique. Calling Vinya's attention, the tamer tells her that they are of the same kind. Planning on killing both Vinya and Neil, the man decides to start with Neil first. With the gunblade so far away, Vinya is unable to do anything. She is also facing another problem, and that is the dragon now charging towards her. A new problem is added for Vinya, as the tamer is now casting a fire spell intended to wipe them out. As Vinya wonders what she should do next, a gunshot is suddenly fired, hitting the tamer's palm and canceling the spell. With a hole in his hand, the tamer screams in pain. Somewhere at a distance, Grace asks Galatea if she saw what he did. Having hit the enemy, Grace asks Galatea if she too thought that it was amazing. Galatea responds that she does, but believes that it would have been quicker to shoot the enemy if Grace had targeted the head. Seeing Grace and Galatea, Vinya smiles as she can now envision hope for them. The tamer immediately recognizes Grace as the third prince from the request. From what the tamer knows, Grace does not have any combat abilities and had even thought that the prince had evacuated. What also intrigues the tamer is the woman behind Grace, since she was not stated in the request. As Grace slides towards her, Vinya thinks that Grace was at the mine. "I ran back," says Grace. He states that a place that takes a day on foot only takes 10 minutes for Galatea to run. Posing in a running position, a blast then comes out of Galatea's heel, giving her an additional boost in tackling the dragon. This shocks the tamer and makes him wonder what on earth the woman is. The tamer cannot believe that Galatea could pack such speed despite her strange appearance. Tackling the dragon down, Galatea reports that she will be going in. Grace informs Vinya that it is now her chance, stating that the earth dragon is vulnerable to ice magic. Grace adds that only certain types of magic are effective against the earth dragon. Hearing this, Vinya turns and looks at the tamer, who is still in pain from the injury he received. Upon realizing that it was just a simple lie, Vinya realizes that Grace was always right all along, and that she needed to be calmer. Focusing her magic towards the earth dragon's head, Vinya then starts to chant and lands the spell Ice Fire Lance. The spell proves to be too powerful for the earth dragon to handle, taking its life. Grace, who is still pointing his gun at the tamer, informs Galatea that he has run out of ammo. Galatea reports to Grace that the target is now escaping. Handing her weapon over, Vinya informs Neil that she has infused a bit of magic before it was blown away, and that he should be able to shoot it now. Vinya only asks of Neil that he does not miss. Planting his sword onto the ground, Neil points the gunblade in the tamer's direction. After taking a deep breath, Neil tells Vinya that he will be borrowing her weapon momentarily. Shooting the gunblade, Neil's shot successfully reaches the tamer and lands a serious blow. However, the tamer still has enough strength to endure the pain and run away. Seeing the tamer flee, Neil wonders if he even hit his target. Grace reassures him that he did, but it does not seem to be a fatal wound. When asked if they should chase their enemy and finish it off, Grace responds and tells everyone that they do not need to chase it too far. The answer shocks Vinya, and she asks, "Why not?" Upon further inspection, Grace is able to confirm something. Grace states that the Earth Dragon has been put under a powerful brainwashing spell. Strong magic leaves traces behind and spreads like thick paint with a brush across paper. Everyone is impressed when Grace reveals that Galatea can detect those traces. Galatea mentions how it was thanks to that function that she was able to notice the village attack at the mine so quickly. Feeling defeated, Vinya wonders if there is anything robots can't do. In short, the one that took Vinya's magic will guide us to the mastermind behind this, says Grace. Keeping it to himself, Grace already has a good idea as to who might be the mastermind. Galatea hands over bags to Vinya and Neil, informing them that those are portable meals and would restore their magic power and stamina. Grace informs Galatea and Neil that Vinya and he will be going out for a bit after they prepare. Grace asks if he could count on them to watch over things at the place. Neil responds that he can, but also asks him where he is headed. "Isn't it obvious, right, Vinya?" says Grace, as he states that they will be settling the matter. Back at the Azure Trading Company, the owner couldn't believe that the assassination attempt had failed. After using so many dragons, the owner asks the tamer how he could possibly have lost. The tamer clarifies that what he brought were wyverns, and that they were defeated by weapons that they had no information on. More than that, the tamer states that a mysterious woman with superhuman strength also appeared and helped Grace. The tamer apologizes and admits that the request was beyond his capabilities. Calling the tamer by his name, Rufus, the owner asks him if he had forgotten how much she had paid him. Rufus warns the owner to give it up and states that he too lost several precious wyverns. A staff member opens the door, informing the owner that they have a problem. Upon informing the owner that they have a visitor, the owner angrily tells the staff member that she would deal with it later, as there is no time for them to be accepting visits. Grace then appears, looking disappointed as he states that he came all the way to their company, only to be turned away at the door again. The owner immediately looks pale, shocked to see Grace. Stuttering, the owner asks Grace what he wants. The owner thinks that the situation has truly turned for the worst, since Rufus is still in the room with them. If Rufus's involvement is discovered, the truth would then be revealed that she was behind the attack. When asked what he wants, Grace states the obvious, that it is business. Nervous all over, the owner continues to stutter and changes her attitude, now more willing to listen to the business Grace wants to talk about. The owner then asks what Grace wants. Grace asks if making a deal with him is okay, reminding the owner that she had turned him away at the door the last time he came to her. Showing a forced smile, the owner points out to Grace that he is now a famous merchant and admits that she was terribly rude to him before. "Well, it's fine," says Grace as he takes a seat. The owner is quite relieved that Rufus is still wearing his full-body hood and thinks that she has to get through the situation somehow. If the truth ever comes out, the owner is certain that it would be the end of her company. About the deal he wants to make, Grace drops a bag and tells the owner that he has some rare wyvern horns and earth dragon scales. Upon hearing the items that Grace brought, both the owner and Rufus are shocked. Seeing that Rufus is reacting to his taunt, Grace asks him what was wrong with him. Grace then tells Rufus that he has a strange outfit, asking him if he is an adventurer. Grace also allows Rufus to have a look at the items he brought, reassuring them that they are of top quality. Wearing a frightening expression, Grace tells Rufus that he must know about those things since he is an adventurer. The owner is now drenched in sweat and nervous while Rufus is holding off his anger. Picking up the horns, Rufus tells the owner that the items are of top quality. Grace is quite pleased to hear it and then asks the owner how much she would pay for them. Scared for her life, the owner tells Grace that she will buy them at whatever price he names. Grace thinks that it sounds very good. Turning to a menacing look again, Grace tells the owner that he will be taking all the money that they have. This finally breaks the owner's mind, making her faint in an instant. Grace then states that he was merely joking and that the market price for the items is just fine. Trembling, the owner hands over the coins. Grace stands up and thanks the owner for making a good deal. Grace shares that the items he brought are precious materials which he happened to find near the village the other day. Grace is very much grateful for the efforts of his people as there were no casualties and he even made a good profit because of it. Before leaving, Grace thanks the owner again. Still in shock, the owner now blames Prince Kyle for what happened as that was not what was agreed on. From their brief interaction, the owner concludes that Grace is not some incompetent prince but rather Grace is someone she should have never messed with in the first place. On their way back, Vigna asks Grace if he is really okay with it, pointing out that he could have taken all their money. Grace tells Vigna that the Azure Trading Company is still a large trading company, and if they were to go bankrupt, many people would end up on the streets. If Grace took all of their money, he believes that he would be no different from his idiot brother. Grace's goal for now is to send a warning. After scaring them like that, Grace is certain that they won't be attacked for a while. Vigna is impressed that Grace is able to think it through. Clenching his fist, Grace holds his anger as he knows that the one behind the Azure Trading Company is the second prince, Kyle, his older brother. It is only a matter of time before his brother gets directly involved. Grace then tells Vigna that they now have to prepare for various things. Donovan calls his companion Silva and asks if he knows what the gathering today is about. Silva has no clue and has only heard from their lord to gather with everyone else. Speaking of their lord, Grace, Donovan notices how Grace has been making something for the past few days which makes him wonder if there's going to be some kind of announcement. Grace enters the room, apologizing to everyone for making them wait. "Oh, here he comes," says Donovan. When Grace shows everyone a blueprint and instructions, Donovan is confused and asks what the drawing is about. Grace informs everyone that it will be the blueprint for what they are going to build moving forward. Hearing that, both Donovan and Silva stare at each other, wondering what it is about. Silva asks Grace if they too will be building it as well. Grace tells Silva that he is right. Grace tells his people that, if it were possible for him to do it alone, then he would do it willingly. However, the project is now on a whole different level of difficulty compared to before. Grace states that the task now requires extensive procedures and manpower, and admits that he cannot manage it by himself. Grace has come up with a solution, and wishes to borrow everyone's strength. Everyone becomes curious as to what they will be building, and what the blueprint is about. Agni approaches Grace asking if he could have a word with him. Agni clarifies that he would willingly help out with whatever request Grace asks. However, he is still clueless about the blueprint, and wants to know what it is exactly. When Agni asks if they could be informed what they will be making, Grace agrees to share it with everyone. In the recent attack, Grace and their territory managed to deal with the problem this time around, but they currently have no guarantee that it will not happen again, and that they might not be more equipped to handle it next time. Grace states that he will no longer allow his land to be easily destroyed while those who can fight are absent. To make things simpler, Grace is trying to make something necessary to protect Asgard, and that is the purpose of the blueprint. After listening to Grace, Agni stretches his arms and asks Grace what their orders are, and they will follow them. Seeing everyone look united, Grace feels pleased and thanks them for helping him out. The next day, Vinya asks if everyone has gathered already. Vinya reminds them that they are members Grace has selected, and gives the order to follow her as she will lead the way while also serving as a guard. Grace calls for Vinya, asking her to wait as he has forgotten something important. As for the compensation for their job, Grace plans on showing his gratitude for everyone's help by giving them bonuses once the project is complete. Donovan, Silva, and everyone else look thrilled upon hearing that Grace will be giving them 3 gold coins per person, which is estimated as the average monthly income of an adventurer. Hearing that, the coal miners become even more motivated and even call Grace the best lord. Seeing everyone happy and thrilled, Grace is very pleased to hear praises coming from them. Grace then turns to Vinya and apologizes to her for taking more time as they were leaving. Vinya does not mind but points out to Grace that with so many people working on the task he would have to pay quite a sum. Grace reassures her that it will not be a problem and tells her to just leave it up to him. Grace believes that morale is the most important thing right now, and asks Vinya if she could take care of things at the mine. Bowman suddenly enters the room, calling for Grace's attention. Grace is glad that Bowman enters, as he coincidentally has something to discuss with him. However, Bowman makes it clear that he wishes to discuss something else with Grace and tells him that that can wait. Unfolding the blueprint, Bowman is about to ask Grace if he is truly planning to make such dangerous weapons. Grace confirms it to Bowman, telling him that they will be making guns. This shocks Bowman, and he sees that Grace has finally decided. Grace responds that he has and states that they now need to arm themselves. Grace mentions that they have opposed the Azure Trading Company and repelled them. A confrontation with his brother is now something unavoidable. Grace tells Bowman that they are now up against the strongest mage in the Vermillion Kingdom. To fight against his brother, Grace plans on facing him with the strongest weapon an ordinary person can wield. Bowman asks Grace if the blueprint is for making the gun he is holding. Grace explains that the gun he is wielding can fire rapidly, is easy to load, and is also quite powerful. However, the blueprint is not the recipe for his gun. Shocked, Bowman asks Grace what he means and what the recipe is for. Grace does not want to tell Bowman a very long story and just tells him about his talent. The World Library is like a knowledge repository that keeps expanding as Grace encounters unknown things. When Grace touches Galatea, a door to the knowledge of other worlds opens, and when he touches Susie's gun, a door to the concept of guns opens as well. By encountering more unknowns, Grace can acquire new knowledge, like opening doors and progressing deeper. Thanks to all the information Grace has accumulated so far, a door to a certain knowledge has been opened. From there, Grace first understands that the gun Susie left behind is unlocking countless doors. It is the ultimate gun that one can only reach after opening many doors. Going back to the topic, Grace explains that the recipe is just the basic manufacturing method for guns, far from the final form. Grace also points out that the gun's rapid-fire capability and ease of handling are far inferior compared to Susie's gun. Confused, Bowman asks Grace what the point is. Grace then makes a request of Bowman, and that is to improve and develop a method to produce a superior gun. Bowman asks Grace if that is what he wanted to talk about. When Grace asks if what he is asking is impossible, Bowman responds by asking if he is sure about making the ultimate gun. Bowman makes it clear to Grace that if he is given permission to make the gun, then all the closed doors in his library might open up on their own. As expected of you, Bowman, says Grace as he suggests that they start with the creation right away, and even offers to help out as much as he can. And so the development of the gun begins. The first step in Grace's task is procuring the necessary materials. Grace was able to secure the necessary resources, such as tools, after conducting business with a man that he met at Edward's party. Under Donovan's leadership, a full-scale development of the mine began. Inside the mine, Donovan and the rest of the coal miners obtained various resources such as mithril, magic stones, iron, and sulfur. Meanwhile, Vinya and the extermination team defeated the giant bats with ease and even managed to obtain some salpeter. At the mansion, Noel was busy with the house chores. When Neil sees his sister struggling, he offers help, for which Noel was very grateful. Curious, Neil asks Noel why she is stacking wood. Noel heard that Grace needed charcoal, which made her think that it would be a waste to just burn it, and she decided to also have a campfire. Galatea overheard the siblings' conversation and thought that it sounded great, after which she then offered to help out. Both siblings were in shock after witnessing Galatea pull out a whole tree from the ground with ease. Neil then stated that the scale is totally different, which he expected nothing less of from his teacher. Later that night, Grace was at first speechless after seeing huge logs being burned, after which he then stated that they really do not need that much charcoal. Pleased with her plan, Noel leans on Grace and tells him that it's a nice atmosphere. However, Grace thinks differently and tells Noel that they have practically made a forest fire now. Because of everyone's efforts, Grace has now obtained a bountiful amount of charcoal. After gathering most of the materials, Bowman then mentioned that it is now his turn to work. Grace's blueprint, which is the recipe of the gun, had already been deciphered by Bowman. In his research, Bowman learns that they would first have to load gunpowder and bullets into the barrel. Next would be igniting the fuse and firing the bullet. In terms from another world, the steps would be called a matchlock firearm. However, Bowman immediately catches on to the many problems that the gun has. In addition to a lag of several tens of seconds from ignition to firing, it is also very difficult to use in rainy weather. But he didn't lose hope, as he found a hint, which was the bullet left by Susie. Susie's gun had some kind of magical lock and couldn't be disassembled, but a considerable amount of ammunition was left with the gun. Bowman felt quite fortunate that the bullets could be easily disassembled. Based on Grace's blueprint, Bowman learns that the bullet is a round metal lump, a pointed cylinder that is also filled with gunpowder. While trying to figure out the bullet, it also made Bowman wonder if there is a flint inside. After disassembling multiple bullets, Bowman then understood the mechanics of the bullet. Grace visits Bowman, asking him about the project's current status. Bowman responds, telling Grace that his plan might actually work out. 2 months passed by and Bowman was able to complete the gun with his unique improvements. By covering the ignition source with metal and firing with the impact of the hammer, Bowman also embeds magic stones imbued with wind magic into part of the barrel. Bowman improved the gun's firing performance by carving spiral grooves. The bullet shape was also improved. Referencing Susie's bullets, unintentionally, Bowman had achieved the evolution from matchlock to rifle musket. For this process to be invented, it took several hundred years in another world, which is the hardest part. On Bowman's part, he managed to achieve such a feat within 2 months, and was now added to the library. Looking through the world library, Bowman thought that it felt like being treated as a great historical figure. Bowman humbly tells Grace that he was just lucky this time, since they already have a very pivotal component, which was Susie's bullet, and also the knowledge that Grace had. Bowman asks Grace to change it to it wasn't Bowman's effort alone while leaving. Expecting nothing less from his blacksmith, Grace thanks Bowman. Bowman laughs and mentions that as a craftsman it was the best bonus he could ask for. The next day, Grace had everyone gathered and showed them the gun that all of them worked together to create over the past few months. "Behold," says Grace. Neil was huffing with excitement, asking Grace multiple times what it was. From what Neil discerned, the weapon is very much similar to his master's sword, which he finds very cool. Agni approaches Grace, asking him what the weapon is used for. That question made Grace realize that he has not explained it in detail, and he also thought about how difficult it is to explain. Grace guessed that seeing it in action would be the quickest way to understand the weapon. After loading the bullet and powder, Grace then places his finger onto the trigger, and then pulls it. The noise coming from the gun was so loud that it shocked Noel and Neil, who were both nearby. After putting a hole into a tree, Grace then informs his men that the weapon is a tool that allows anyone to kill easily. Agni and the coal miners were in shock, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Agni looked very worried and asked Grace if he had truly ordered them to create a weapon that can kill. When Agni asks Grace what he is going to do with the weapon, he is shocked when Grace suddenly tries to hand the weapon over to him. Seeing Agni's reaction, Grace told him not to freak out. Grace then pointed out that even knives and blunt objects can be considered deadly depending on how they're used, and that what matters most is how one uses the object. Putting down the gun, Grace then offers to teach everyone what the guns will bring about. After Grace showed a map, Agni became confused and asked what it was. Grace explains that it is a map that summarizes the areas around Asgard. Grace informs Agni that the population of Asgard has been growing and asks if he doesn't feel a bit cramped. Realizing that Grace had a point, Agni mentions the rapid increase of temporary shelters in the village ruins. With everyone mostly staying in that location, Agni believes that it might be difficult to accept any more people. Agni then asks Grace if they are expanding the residential area, to which Grace tells Agni that he is correct and that it will be to the northwest. Hearing such news, Agni becomes more thrilled to have more comrades. When Agni asked what the northwest is like, Grace couldn't answer right away. Gathering his thoughts, Grace then informs Agni that the northwest is the area where monsters spawn most easily, even in monster-ridden Asgard. What frightened Agni and the others more is learning that the northwest is called the Forest of Death. Agni's bright smile instantly vanished, forcing him to change his mind about having more comrades and not wanting them anymore. Grace tells Agni to wait and explains his plan of destroying the source of the monsters, which he is certain would greatly improve their lives dramatically. Grace also stated that for the time being, the Northwest is not an impossible goal but rather something to test their current strength. Grace wants to use the Northwest residential expansion as a debut for their combat prowess. Hearing Grace's plan, he was asked if he was truly serious. After their meeting, some of the miners approach Agni about it and he intends to follow along for now. The miners understand but wonder if what Grace said is true, that even they are now capable of defeating monsters. Hearing his colleague Silva turns to Donovan and calls his name. The two then gather a bunch of the miners and call Grace's attention. Unable to look Grace straight in the eye, Donovan apologizes and asks Grace if he could leave them out of the operation. Hearing that, Grace remains silent, understanding that some are still afraid. Donovan clarifies that they do not intend to make only the others fight either and have no problem if Grace wants them to leave. If they were to be forced out of Asgard, Donovan believes that it would give more space in the residential area. Silva also apologizes to Grace and bravely admits that he is too scared of monsters. Silva remembers how they became refugees after being driven from their village by monsters. When their village was weakened by war, the monsters seized the opportunity and swarmed in, eventually ravaging the whole place. Before Silva could continue, Grace interrupted him, as he understood Silva's feelings and instead asked him to take the shovel and to get ready. Confused, Silva asks what the shovel is for. Silva turns to Grace, asking him if he was even listening to what he said. Grace responds that he did, and tells Silva that it is precisely why he, Donovan, and everyone else should come all the more. Out in the field, Silva, Agni, and the others are digging the ground. Silva tells Agni that what they are doing is truly insane, and asks if they are really going to fight such monsters. Silva turns to Agni, asking him the purpose of them digging holes. Agni himself had no clue and even admitted that he really doesn't understand what Grace is saying. However, what Agni could guess is that it must be useful for something. Showing a look of doubt, Silva continues to dig the hole and states that he really does not understand Grace at all. Several days later, Grace proceeds with providing instructions to everyone on how to handle guns, learn tactics, and procure necessary supplies. The residents worked hard to prepare, and before they knew it, the day had already arrived for them to test out what they learned. Leading the men, Grace informed everyone that they would wake the monsters with gunfire and asked them if they were ready. With everyone responding that they were, Grace felt confident. However, upon turning to his side, he noticed Silva trembling. When Silva was asked if he was alright, he honestly told Grace that he was scared and asked if he had a problem with that. Grace responded that he did not and that it was fine for now. After giving the signal to charge, Grace's troop proceeds to enter the forest and immediately encounters huge monsters. Surrounded, everyone becomes frightened, asking themselves if they are really going to fight such monsters. Silva orders everyone to fall back before the monsters let out fire from their mouths. A man who almost got burnt felt terrified after witnessing the monster suddenly spewing fire. Hiding along with everyone else, Grace then proves to them that the trenches they made are very useful, allowing them to hide first and then go again. Silva just remains silent, staring at Grace. After positioning themselves inside the trench, Grace then informed his men that it takes time for the serpents to breathe fire again, which gives them their chance to counterattack. With the guns pointed in the serpents' direction, Grace then gives the order to fire. Multiple bullets hail down on the serpents, piercing through their bodies. The counterattack Grace devised proved to be successful, as they eliminated the serpents in an instant. The coal miners were still in shock and amazed that they actually killed giant fire serpents, which are monsters that even guild elites struggle in dealing with. Grace tells his men not to space out and orders those who fired their weapons to reload and switch with the unit behind them. "Alright," says Bowman. Raising his weapon, Silva was shocked when he noticed that all the monsters had come out of the forest and were headed toward them. Silva frighteningly says how nice it is of the monsters to charge at them all at once. As Silva becomes curious as to what is happening, Bowman informs him that it is Grace's strategy. Bowman pointed out that they've surrounded the forest with the Guardian's Chain and have limited the routes the monsters can take. In other words, Grace has set things up for the monsters to become their perfect targets. Grace ordered the second unit to keep shooting. Shocked, Silva asks himself if they could really do it. Silva notices something again and tries to inform everyone that the situation is turning bad. Silva alerts everyone that something hard is charging at them. Grace immediately recognizes the monster as an armored armadillo and states that the gun they are using does not have enough power for it. Panicking, Silva asks Grace what they will do. The armored armadillo continues to roll toward their location, crushing the other monsters that are within its path. Before the armored armadillo could reach Grace and his men, Galatea steps in and punches the armored armadillo. This action shocks both Donovan and Silva. Galatea mentions that she will be the final line of defense, and since guns don't work on her, she informs everyone that they can attack without worry. Silva turns to Grace, telling him how it would be better to leave it all up to Galatea. Grace responds, telling Silva to stop saying such stupid things. Grace explains that no matter how strong Galatea and Vigine are, it is impossible for them to protect everyone against that many monsters. Grace points it out to Silva that they are holding the battle line because they all have the power to fight. Grace wants everyone to have strength and confidence, which is also the reason why he made the guns. Hearing that from Grace leaves Silva speechless. Agni calls Grace's attention, reporting to him that their bullets are not hitting the flying monsters and are now charging at them. As the monster is about to strike their comrades, everyone is shocked when they witness the monster being shot down. Everyone is in disbelief as they see Silva actually hitting the flying monster. Silva too doesn't know why, but he has a strange familiar feeling in his hands. At first Silva thinks it is just his imagination, but after shooting down the monster he realizes that he can now actually fight back. Grace smiles as he feels proud of Silva for gaining courage. Grace hands his rifle to Silva and Silva asks him if he is sure. Pulling out his pistol, Grace tells Silva that he still has a weapon and that he is counting on him for the ones in the sky. As multiple flying monsters are now focusing on Silva, he is no longer fazed by them. With the two rifles, Silva points them at the sky and accurately shoots down the monsters. Silva then puts one of the rifles under his arm while reloading the other rifle. Agni is again shocked, witnessing Silva taking down all of the flying monsters. Galatea also cannot hide her surprised expression as she is about to say something to Grace. However, Grace already knows what Galatea is about to say. Grace states that just like how he gained the world library by continuing to read books, it is a rare miracle that occurs when someone with an aptitude keeps using an object they have an affinity for. Grace believes that after using the weapon multiple times, Silva has awakened his own talent. Unbeknownst to Silva, he has gained the talent Shooting King. Silva's talent dramatically improves his shooting abilities, guaranteeing hits and enabling rapid reloading. Hiding in the trenches, Agni tries to take a peek while asking if Silva has actually taken out all of the flying monsters. Donovan was surprised after hearing that Silva had awakened his talent. Silva approaches Grace, wanting to confirm if the reason he wanted them to go to the Forest of Death is related to what he gained. Grace responds and tells Silva that it was part of the plan, but it is not the only reason. Showing a map, Grace asks them if they didn't notice it. Grace points out that the forest isn't far from the village where they used to live, which meant that the monsters that made them refugees were likely born in the Forest of Death. Both Donovan and Silva were shocked upon hearing Grace's theory. Grace then asks the two to look, telling them that they have won a decisive victory against the monsters that once overwhelmed them. "No way," says Silva, as both he and Donovan have actually become the victors. The two then both sit down, telling Grace that he could have told them from the beginning. After that, most of the monsters in the Forest of Death were exterminated, and the area of movement within Asgard has expanded significantly. While exploring the now safe areas, Grace discovers Susie's abandoned mountain cabin. Grace, however, is unable to read the characters on the board. As they search through the cabin, Grace sees a crate and pries it open. Grace is shocked when he sees an item that is tagged as Sight, an attachment that allows for aiming at greater distances when handling a gun. Upon touching the item, Grace gains new knowledge and power. With the completion of the guns, Asgard takes a big step forward. However, in any era, powerful weapons do not always bring only benefits, which Grace has already accounted for. Seeing his men, Grace calls for Donovan. Pleased to see his lord, Donovan asks Grace if he has now returned from his exploration. Donovan explains that they are currently in the middle of gun training and asks if he needs something. Grace responds by asking where Silva is. From Grace's knowledge, he thought that Silva would be diligently training. Donovan then shares with Grace how Silva's motivation is incredible and how Silva went to wipe out all the monsters in Asgard. Shocked, Grace asks Donovan if he is joking and whether Silva really went alone into the forest. However, Donovan tells the truth and asks Grace if there is a problem. Donovan isn't that worried about Silva since he has awakened a combat-oriented talent and even did an amazing job in the last battle. Grace agrees with Donovan but points out to him that it was a victory that they achieved all together. Even if Silva has a talent, Grace states that as long as it takes 10 seconds to reload, the true value of a rifle is only realized when there are many people. More importantly, Grace wonders what Silva is planning to do if he is unable to take down the prey with the first shot. Donovan's face turns pale upon realizing Grace's point. Grace then informs Galatea and Donovan that they will bring Silva back now. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, upon hearing about the place from the dragon tamer, Silva never expected that it would have so many monsters. Trapped, a man speaks and states how he cannot come to play very often. Scared out of his wits, Silva wonders who the men are and if they are using magic. Silva starts asking himself why he was so easily defeated despite gaining a talent, and even wielding a gun that supports his talent. Silva wonders as to who the person he is now up against is.